Picture this. It's roughly 20,000 years ago, and you're standing at the edge of a frozen world. To your east, a wall of ice, taller than any skyscraper, stretches for thousands of miles. To your west, the ocean is doing something strange. It's dropping, hundreds of feet lower than it is today. Land that should be underwater is sitting exposed to the sky, and somehow, against odds that seem almost impossible, human beings are moving through this landscape. They're heading somewhere new, somewhere no human has ever set foot before. The Americas. For decades, we've been told a simple story about how this happened. People walked across a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, then squeezed through a narrow gap between two massive ice sheets, and just like that, humanity spread across two entire continents. Clean, simple, done, except it's not that simple, not even close. Here's the problem nobody likes to talk about, that so-called ice-free corridor, the one you probably learned about in school. For much of the Ice Age, it wasn't exactly a welcoming highway. Try picturing a corridor pinched between glaciers, scraped bare of plants, animals, and fresh water, for potentially thousands of years at a stretch. Walking through it wouldn't have been a stroll, it might have been a death sentence. So, if the interior route was blocked, or at best barely survivable, how did people actually get south? How did humans end up in places like Chile, within a window that barely gives them time to walk the interior route at all? This is where things get interesting, because there's another possibility, one that's been gaining serious traction among archaeologists and geneticists alike. What if people didn't march through the middle of the continent at all? What if they hugged the coastline instead, moving along a ribbon of shoreline packed with food, kelp forests, seals, fish, shellfish, all the calories you'd need to keep moving south, generation after generation? Now, to be clear, Beringia still matters. The land bridge is real, the genetics back it up, and nobody's throwing that story out. But it might not be the whole story, it might be one piece of a much bigger, messier, more fascinating puzzle. And today, that's exactly what we're digging into. We're going to walk through Ice Age coastlines that don't exist anymore, submerged by rising seas. We'll explore the Kelp highway idea, the boats humans may have already had in their toolkit long before reaching the Americas, the handful of coastal sites that are rewriting timelines, and what genetics can and can't tell us about which route people actually took. Along the way, we'll be honest about where scientists agree and where the debate is still very much alive. No overselling here, just the evidence and the open questions. If you're using this to wind down for the night, that's exactly why I make these. So do me a favour, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing it. Tokyo at sunrise, Chicago at midnight, all reading the same story at once. And if you want an ad-free way to listen, follow this show on Spotify. It genuinely helps support the work, and if you're feeling generous, a 5-star review goes a long way too. Alright, let's get into it. Because the real story of how humans reached the Americas might be written along a coastline that mostly disappeared beneath the waves. Let's give the classic story its due, because it's not wrong. It's just incomplete. Beringia was real. Not a myth, not a metaphor, an actual landscape you could have walked across, hunted across, raised children on. At the height of the last ice age, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped by more than 300 feet in places. That drop exposed a stretch of land connecting Siberia to Alaska that wasn't a thin little bridge like the name suggests. At its widest, Beringia stretched close to 1,000 miles from north to south. That's not a bridge, that's practically its own continent. Grass grew there, herds of bison, mammoth and horse moved across it. People lived there, not just passed through it. For thousands of years, Beringia wasn't a hallway between two rooms. It was a room of its own. Now, The traditional model built on top of that landscape goes something like this. Populations from Siberia moved into Beringia sometime before the peak of the Ice Age. They lived there for a while, maybe a long while, adapting to the cold, the wind, the strange rhythms of a subarctic grassland. Then, as the ice sheets over North America began retreating, a corridor opened up between two massive glacial systems, the Laurentide to the east and the Cordilleran to the west. People supposedly funneled through that gap, moved south into the interior of the continent, and from there fanned out across two entire hemispheres. Simple, linear, tidy, point A to point B to point C. And for a long time, that story held up reasonably well, mostly because it matched the evidence we had. Stone tools found at sites like Clovis, New Mexico, seemed to represent one of the earliest widespread technologies in the Americas. Genetic studies showed Native American populations were closely related to Siberian populations, with signs of a shared ancestral group that geneticists sometimes call the Beringian Standstill population. The dates seemed to line up. The logic seemed sound. Case closed, right? Except the more researchers dug, quite literally, the more pressure points started showing up in the story. The first crack is timing. That ice-free corridor wasn't necessarily open when people needed it to be. Some studies suggest it didn't become biologically viable, meaning actually capable of supporting plants, animals, and human travellers, until sometime around 13,000 years ago. But archaeological sites in South America, places like Monteverde in Chile, appear to date to around 14,500 years ago or earlier. That's a problem. If the corridor wasn't usable until 13,000 years ago, how did people already have settlements thousands of miles south of it more than 1,000 years earlier? The second crack is speed. Even if the corridor opened exactly when needed, we're still asking people to travel from Alaska to the southern tip of South America in a window that, geologically speaking, is barely a blink. That's not impossible. Humans can move fast when they need to. But it does mean the old picture of slow, gradual, generation-by-generation drift through the interior starts looking awfully tight on time. And the third crack is the earliest sites themselves. The more archaeologists search, the more early sites they're finding that don't fit neatly with a strictly interior migration. Sites that are coastal, or at least coastally adjacent. Sites that predate what the corridor model comfortably allows for. So here's where the real scientific debate actually lives. It's not really Beringia versus no Beringia. Almost nobody disputes that Beringia happened. The genetics are too consistent, the geology too well documented. The real debate is whether Beringia was the only route, or whether it was one entry point among several, feeding not just one path south, but possibly two, an interior corridor and a coastal one, operating at different times, maybe even by different groups. And that's the shift worth sitting with for a second. Coastal and interior routes don't have to compete with each other. They're not mutually exclusive theories where only one gets to be right. They could be complementary pieces of a much bigger migration story, different currents feeding into the same eventual outcome, human beings spreading across two continents. Which raises an obvious question. If people weren't just walking through the middle of the ice, what exactly did that alternate coastal world even look like? To answer that, we need to go back to the ice sheets themselves. Because understanding why the interior was such a brutal gauntlet is the key to understanding why the coastline might have been the far better option all along. When people picture the last ice age in North America, they often imagine a kind of frosty wallpaper, a vague sheet of ice draped over Canada, cold but basically static. The real situation was much worse. It wasn't one ice sheet, it was two. And they didn't just sit there politely. They moved, they flowed, they advanced and retreated like living things that happened to be made of a mile of frozen water. On the eastern side of the continent sat the Laurentide ice sheet. This thing was a monster. At its maximum, it covered almost all of modern Canada east of the Rockies and pushed deep into what's now the northern United States. Think Hudson Bay, the Great Lakes region, New England, the upper Midwest, all smashed under ice up to 1 kilometre or more thick. No forests, no grasslands, just a grinding, creaking slab that bulldozed everything in its path. On the western side you had the Cordilleran ice sheet, draped over the mountain chains of what's now British Columbia, the Yukon and parts of Alaska. It filled valleys, drowned entire ranges, sent tongues of ice spilling down toward the Pacific. Where you now have temperate rainforest and salmon rivers, you had towering glaciers, carving into icy bays and damming up meltwater lakes the size of small seas. Between them, for long stretches of the last ice age, basically nothing you'd want to live in. When the Laurentide and Cordilleran pushed toward each other, they did more than form a barrier. They fused. Ice from the east met ice from the west, and locked together over what's now Western Canada. That merger is what the traditional ice-free corridor story is built around, because the only way an interior route down into the heart of the continent works is if that merger doesn't last forever. For people in Beringia hoping to move south, the details of those ice sheets weren't abstract. They were life or death, were the two sheets touching or separated. If separated, by how much? Was that gap just bare rock and meltwater? Or was it something you could actually walk through and survive in? The interior route hangs entirely on those questions. It's one thing to have a strip of land that technically isn't covered by ice. It's another thing to have a corridor that's habitable, to move families, elders, kids, and whatever possessions you can carry. You need more than open ground. You need plants colonizing the newly exposed soil. You need grazing animals following those plants. You need fresh water that isn't just glacial torrents ripping everything apart. In other words, you need an ecosystem, not just a crack between two walls of ice. And here's where climate swings turn the map into a moving target. The last glacial cycle wasn't a neat on-off switch of ice and no ice. It was a series of pulses. Temperatures would rise a bit, ice would retreat, meltwater would pour out, new land would open up. Then things would cool again, glaciers would surge forward, and that new land could vanish under ice, or be scoured down to raw rock all over again. From our perspective, looking at long graphs of climate data, it's tempting to smooth those pulses into a gentle curve. But imagine it from the ground, generation by generation. Your grandparents might have known a valley with a decent grass cover, small herds of caribou or bison, some scattered shrubs you could use for firewood. By your own adulthood, advancing ice or a shift in storm tracks might have turned that same valley into a wind-blasted wasteland of gravel, melt ponds and dust. Your children might grow up hearing stories about good land that no longer exists. That constant reshuffling complicates any simple migration story. Even if at some point a narrow path opened between Laurentide and Cordilleran ice, how long did it stay open? Decades, centuries, a few thousand years. And more importantly, when did it shift from just not under ice to support enough life that human beings can actually travel through without starving? The key question isn't just, was there ever an ice-free corridor? Geologists are pretty confident that at certain times there was. The sharper question is, was there a usable corridor south from Beringia at the right time for the earliest people we see farther down in the Americas? If a corridor only became biologically viable around, say, 13,000 years ago, but you already have people fishing and gathering plants at Monteverde in Chile more than 1,000 years before that, the calendar starts to look wrong for a purely interior solution. That doesn't kill the idea that people later used the corridor. It just means it can't be the whole story of the first waves. Now contrast that unstable inland world with the edges of the continent, along the Pacific margin. The ice behaved differently. Yes, there were glaciers pouring down to the sea, especially in places like southeast Alaska and the British Columbia coast. Yes, there were ice-choked fjords and brutal storms. This was not some gentle seaside vacation. But between those glacier tongues, you'd often have stretches of exposed land and shallow continental shelf that are now underwater. And those edges tended to follow a more predictable rulebook than the chaotic interior. Coastlines, especially in cold, nutrient-rich oceans, support what ecologists call productive environments. Kelp forests, shellfish beds, salmon runs, sea mammals, seabirds. Even when the interior is locked in ice and the vegetation is struggling to take hold on freshly deglaciated soil, the sea can still be teeming with life. If you know how to fish, how to hunt seals, how to gather seaweed and shellfish, that's a huge advantage. So imagine you're a group in Beringia facing two options. To your southeast, an interior gap between two gigantic ice sheets that may or may not be open, may or may not have food, may or may not close again within a few generations. To your south and southwest, a ragged, broken coastline, challenging but potentially lined with relatively steady marine resources, punctuated by ice-free pockets where rivers meet the sea and plants can take root early. The inland route is high risk, high uncertainty. The coastal fringe, while dangerous in its own ways, may offer a more continuous belt of things you can actually eat. This is the logic behind the coastal hypothesis. It isn't that the interior corridor never existed, or that no one ever used it. It's that, in a world sliced in half by Laurentide and Cordilleran ice, the first viable path south may have hugged the edge of the continent rather than cutting through its frozen heart. And to test that, we have to ask a sharper version of the corridor question. Not just was the land open, but where exactly was it livable, and when? So let's zoom in on that when, and what kind of land are we talking about, because this is where the ice-free corridor goes from a simple arrow on a textbook map to a serious scientific argument. Geologists and glaciologists are mostly asking one basic question. When did the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets pull far enough apart that bare ground existed between them? Biologists, paleobotanists, and archaeologists are asking a different, sharper one. When did that gap stop being a sterile strip of mud, rock and floodwater and start being an actual ecosystem? Those are not the same date. When ice retreats, it doesn't leave behind a ready-made prairie. It leaves behind what's called a young landscape. Imagine raw, scraped bedrock, rubble, sand and glacial silt. Meltwater rushing through unstable channels, lakes dammed by ice that can burst catastrophically. There might be little pockets of moss or lichens, maybe some hardy grasses, but nothing you could base a migration of hundreds or thousands of kilometers on. To turn that into a highway, you need time. Time for seeds to arrive and germinate. Time for shrubs, and then trees to take root. Time for insects and birds and small mammals to move in. Only then will the big herbivores, bison, elk, maybe mammoths in earlier phases, start treating this new corridor like a route worth following. And people, if they're smart, will follow the animals. So how do we figure out when that transformation happened? One line of evidence comes from the sediments of lakes and bogs that formed in and around the suspected corridor zone, especially in modern Alberta and British Columbia. When organic material, pollen, tiny plant bits, microscopic algae, falls into those water bodies, it can accumulate in thin layers that build up over thousands of years. Later, when scientists take cores from those sediments, they're basically reading a vertical timeline of past ecosystems. Radiocarbon dates from these cores tell us when the first plants started colonizing the deglaciated land. Pollen analysis shows what kinds of plants are we looking at pioneer tundra vegetation, or something like a shrubland or open forest that can support larger animals. Ancient DNA pulled from those same sediments can even reveal which animals were around: bison, mammoth, horses, predators. Put all that together, and you get a picture that's more nuanced than corridor open, corridor closed. You get corridor icy and dead, then corridor muddy with a bit of moss, then corridor with enough grass and shrubs to support bison, and only later corridor with a full food web. The current reading of that record points to a tough conclusion for the classic story. The corridor seems to have become biologically viable, meaning it supported a decent community of plants and big game only around 12,600 to 12,000 years ago. In some reconstructions, even a bit later. By that point, we already have people south of the ice sheets who've been there for centuries, probably longer. Clovis cultures spread across the interior plains by about 13,000 years ago. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile suggest human presence well before that. Even if you throw out the most controversial early dates, the timing is tight. So yes, there might have been deglaciated land earlier. But deglaciated doesn't mean walk your grandparents through here without starving. It might mean a narrow, flood-ridden valley bordered by walls of ice, with almost no vegetation, unstable lakes, and very little to hunt. Could desperate, highly adapted hunter-gatherers still move through a landscape like that? Maybe in small groups, hugging riverbanks, living off fish and the occasional carcass. But that's a very different scenario than a broad demographic wave pouring south through a lush inland passage. For the corridor to be the main initial route, we'd expect it to leave behind a footprint, and not just in mud and pollen. A major migration highway tends to generate a string of archaeological signatures, campsites or kill sites spaced along the route, repeated use of certain choke points. The same kinds of stone tools made from the same rock sources showing up like breadcrumbs as people move through. In the ice-free corridor, the smoking gun evidence would look something like this: a series of well-dated human sites along that interior gap, with ages that match or predate the earliest secure sites south of the ice. Stone tools made from northern raw materials appearing farther south in a time-linked sequence. Animal bones with clear-cut marks and human-made spear points embedded in them, all sitting in stratigraphic layers that line up with the period when the corridor first turns ecologically green. Right now, that kind of evidence is thin to non-existent for the crucial early window. There are later sites in the corridor region, once we're into the fully habitable phase. But they look more like people expanding back north through a recovering interior, not like the very first trickle heading south. That's why many researchers now treat the corridor not as the original gateway, but as a secondary route, hugely important just later in the story. Once the ice sheets pulled back and the corridor fully greened up, it would have become an attractive path for movement in both directions. Groups already in the continental interior could push north to new hunting grounds. Northern populations could move south or east more easily. Gene flow would increase. Ideas, tool styles, and even languages could spread along this newly opened interior artery. In that sense, the corridor might have been to later Pleistocene and early Holocene peoples. What an interstate highway is today. Not the first way anyone ever got into a region, but the route that really connects everything once it's built. So when you hear ice-free corridor, it's worth mentally translating, not magical unlocked door to the Americas, but complex, changing landscape that only turned into a reliable passage after the first humans were probably already on the other side. And that brings us back to the Pacific margin. If the inland gate opened too late to explain the earliest evidence, and if its ecological recovery lagged behind its physical deglaciation, then we're pushed back toward the shoreline, toward the places where the land met the ocean and the ocean was already alive. Which leads to the next big problem. If the first travellers hugged the coast, why is it so hard to find where they were? Because on paper, the Pacific coast looks perfect. Rich marine ecosystems, rivers dumping salmon into the ocean, ice-free refuges popping open along the shoreline before the interior is ready. If you were a late Ice Age hunter-gatherer staring at a wall of ice inland and a food-backed ocean to your side, the choice seems obvious. But there's a catch. The coast you're picturing is not the coast they walked during the last glacial maximum around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago. So much water was locked up in ice sheets that global sea level was roughly 120 meters lower than today. That's like dropping the entire ocean down the height of a 35-story building. If you drained that much water right now, the outline of continents would change dramatically. Shelves of land that are now underwater would suddenly be exposed as broad plains, rocky terraces, and low rolling shorelines. Along the North Pacific, that lower sea level would have pushed the actual coastline far out from where modern maps draw the line between land and sea. In many places, the Ice Age beach could be tens of kilometers seaward of today's shore. Estuaries, tidal flats, sheltered bays, exactly the kinds of places coastal foragers love, would have been out on that now drowned fringe. Fast forward to the end of the Ice Age, the big ice sheets start to melt. Sea level doesn't just rise, it surges, sometimes in rapid pulses. Over thousands of years, the ocean marches back across those exposed shelves, flooding the old beaches, drowning river mouths, eating into coastal plains. Any camps, middens, fish traps, or seasonal villages that had been built along that earlier shoreline get taken with it. If early groups really did travel south along a coastal route, many of their best stopping points are now under tens of meters of water. The hearths, the broken tools, the food remains, the burials. They're still there in principle, but they're buried under marine sediments, hidden in submerged landscapes we're only just starting to map properly. This is the simplest and most frustrating reason coastal evidence is hard to come by. We've spent more than a century digging inland, following rivers and dry valleys and rock shelters, because that's where the ground still is. Meanwhile, the places that would have been prime real estate for Ice Age shoreline travellers have literally slipped beneath the waves. So how do you look for the archaeology of a coastline that no longer exists? One approach starts with bathymetry, the underwater equivalent of topographic mapping. Using sonar, scientists can build high-resolution models of the seafloor, revealing drowned river channels, ancient shorelines, terraces and basins. On those maps, you can sometimes see the ghost of the old landscape, where rivers once meandered across exposed plains, where bays and lagoons would have formed, where rocky headlands might have offered vantage points and landing spots. Once you have that paleogeography, you can apply predictive modelling. This is basically the same logic archaeologists use on land, but rotated out under the water. You ask if I were a small band of hunter-gatherers moving along this drowned coast 16,000 or 18,000 years ago, where would I camp? Near fresh water, near a sheltered landing, somewhere with access to shellfish beds, fish runs, sea mammals, and maybe terrestrial game. Then you mark those high probability zones and plan where to search. Underwater archaeology comes next, and this is where it gets expensive and slow. Divers, remotely operated vehicles, coring equipment, sometimes even submersibles. You're not walking a ploughed field looking for stoneflakes. You're probing sediments in cold, murky water, often at depths where bottom time is limited and visibility is terrible. Each potential site takes serious logistics just to check. That doesn't mean it's impossible. Around the world, researchers are already finding submerged prehistoric sites, stone tools and hearths off the coast of Australia, Mesolithic camps under the North Sea, ancient structures in the Mediterranean. On the Pacific side of the Americas, There are hints too. Submerged terraces and channel systems that look promising, a few underwater finds near later occupation zones, but the systematic search is still in its early days. This leads straight into a huge bias in our story. Inland sites, especially those in caves, rock shelters, or dry basins, have a much better chance of surviving and being discovered. They're not hammered by waves, buried under marine mud, or locked beneath dozens of meters of water. Archaeologists can drive to them, walk across them, and dig them with shovels instead of submersibles. So, for decades, our narrative of the peopling of the Americas has been built mostly from what survives and is easiest to find. Interior plain sites, canyon sites, high desert sites, upland lake shores. These records are incredibly valuable, but they're also only half the picture. If a big chunk of early coastal life is now sitting on a submerged shelf, then the inland record is, almost by definition, the record of people who have already moved away from the first shoreline route. That's how you end up with a kind of archaeological tunnel vision. You see the Clovis spread across the interior, because Clovis points preserve well and are easy to spot. You see later inland foragers, farmers and city builders. You don't see the earliest camp circles tucked along the glacial era shore, because the modern ocean is literally on top of them. And then it becomes tempting to say, we don't have coastal evidence, so the coastal route must not have mattered. This is where we have to be careful with that famous phrase. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. If your best candidate campsites are underwater, the fact that your land-based shovel test pits come up empty along today's rocky shore tells you very little about what happened on the Ice Age coast. It just tells you that the shoreline moved. At the same time, we haven't found it yet, is not the same thing as there definitely was a massive coastal migration. You can't flip the logic and treat the missing record as automatic proof. What you can say honestly is that the playing field is tilted. The inland story has had a century head start. The coastal story is locked behind technological, logistical, and funding barriers. As bathymetric mapping improves, as predictive models get more precise, and as underwater archaeology matures, that imbalance may start to shift. We may eventually find that string of early shoreline camps, or we may find something more complicated. Either way, we can't judge the coastal route solely by what's visible on dry land today. To follow the first Americans along the Pacific margin, we have to chase a moving coastline into the past. And that means thinking about what those drowned shores actually offered. Which brings us to an idea that has reshaped the entire debate, the so-called Kelp Highway. So, what is this Kelp Highway actually supposed to be? Start with the ecosystem itself. A kelp forest is basically an underwater jungle. Giant brown seaweeds, some of them stretching 30-40 meters from seafloor to surface, anchored to rocks and swaying in the current. Those fronds create structure, three-dimensional habitat in a world that without them would be mostly bare rock and sand. Life loves structure. Fish hide in it. Snails and urchins graze on it. Crabs and lobsters hunt in it. Seals and sea otters patrol the edges. Seabirds dive through the canopy. Bits of dead kelp break off, drift and rain down as food on deeper habitats. The whole thing runs on sunlight and cold, nutrient-rich water, and it can crank out biomass at a rate that rivals tropical rainforests. That's already impressive. But from a human point of view, what matters is that kelp forests concentrate edible resources in predictable shallow water right next to land. If you can reach that near-shore zone by wading at low tide, paddling a small boat, or working the rocky intertidal, you suddenly have access to a buffet that renews itself endlessly. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, seaweeds themselves, and in some regions marine mammals. You don't have to chase herds across open country or guess where migratory animals will be months from now. The food is tethered to the coastline. Now stretch that idea along the Pacific Rim. From northeastern Asia, down the Aleutian chain, along southern Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, all the way to Baja California, you have a long belt of cold to cool, nutrient-rich water. Wherever rocky shorelines and shallow shelves line up with those conditions, kelp forests can form. They're not continuous like a literal road, but they occur in patches and clusters, dense in some areas, thinner in others, like gas stations on a long highway. That's the core of the Kelp Highway hypothesis. It says late Ice Age people moving along the North Pacific coast didn't just have a generic seashore. They had access to a relatively continuous chain of highly productive kelp-based ecosystems. Those ecosystems could have acted as a stable food backbone, making a coastal route not only possible but attractive. This matters for mobility. If you're a small band, 20, 30 people, trying to move through unfamiliar territory, uncertainty is dangerous. You need to know that wherever you stop next, you can probably feed everyone. Interior routes through glaciated or periglacial landscapes are risky. Huge stretches of low productivity, big seasonal swings, lots of unknowns. A kelp-rich coast is different. You can travel in short hops. Move a day or two along the shore, set up camp near a promising headland or bay, harvest shellfish, fish in the kelp edge, gather seaweed, hunt seabirds. Stay for a season if it works, move on if it doesn't. The backbone of your subsistence is not one fragile resource, but a whole web of marine foods that tends to be resilient, because the base of the system, kelp, is fed by ocean currents, not local rainfall. Add in river mouths cutting through the coast, and things get even better. Where glacial meltwater or small coastal rivers hit the sea, you often get salmon runs, freshwater, and access to terrestrial game inland. So a group travelling along this margin doesn't have to choose between ocean people and land people. They can be both, shifting focus depending on season and opportunity, while still using the coastline as their main highway. Of course, calling it a highway can be a bit misleading. Nobody is claiming that there was a literal, single-file line of people hugging one kelp forest after another, marching in lockstep from Beringia to Chile. The hypothesis doesn't require that every early migrant used the coast, or that they used it in exactly the same way at the same time. It doesn't even say kelp was the only thing that mattered. People would have been exploiting beaches, estuaries, inland valleys, river corridors, whatever worked. What the Kelp Highway idea really argues is more modest and more interesting, that a chain of rich, relatively predictable marine ecosystems along the North Pacific made a coastal migration ecologically plausible and potentially efficient. It's a counter to the old picture of the coast as some marginal barren fringe that people would avoid until they'd mastered the interior. And crucially, it's a hypothesis. It makes testable predictions about what we should find if this style of life and movement actually happened. If small bands were moving along kelp-backed shorelines 16,000 or 17,000 years ago, we'd expect to see coastal archaeological sites that show intensive use of marine resources. Think shell middens, thick layers of discarded shells, fish bones, sea mammal remains, burned rock, charcoal. We'd expect to find tools suited to coastal foraging and nearshore fishing, barbed points, harpoons, gorges, net sinkers, stone or bone implements designed for processing fish and marine mammals. In some regions, we might see evidence for watercraft technology, even if the boats themselves never preserve. Woodworking tools shaped by repeated contact with wet wood, patterns of site location that only make sense if people were routinely crossing inlets or hopping between islands, maybe even fish traps or weirs in drowned river mouths. On the biological side, human remains from these early coastal populations, if we can find them, should carry chemical signatures of a marine-rich diet. That's where stable isotope analysis comes in. The ratios of certain isotopes, like carbon-13 and nitrogen-15, differ between marine and terrestrial food webs. Bones and teeth effectively record what people were eating over long periods. If the highway was real in an ecological sense, we'd expect those isotopes to skew strongly toward marine values. We'd also expect the geography of sites to line up with reconstructed paleo-coastlines and kelp habitats. Early camps would sit near ancient rocky shores, former headlands, the mouths of rivers and fjords that would have intersected kelp forests during lower sea level stands. As we improve our reconstructions of Ice Age oceanography and underwater topography, we can test whether known early coastal sites fall into those sweet spots and whether the gaps in the record line up with drowned, hard-to-survey shelves. So far we have pieces of this pattern, later shell middens, clear maritime adaptations on both sides of the Pacific, hints of early coastal sites, but not the full chain you'd want to call the Kelp Highway conclusively proven. Still, as an organising idea, it does something powerful. It forces us to think of the Ice Age Pacific not as a frozen wall at the edge of the world, but as a dynamic food-rich corridor, a place where small, mobile, seafaring-capable groups could move, stop and thrive, using kelp forests as stepping stones between Beringia and the Americas. To see whether that was actually happening, we also have to ask a harder question. Were humans, by the time they reached this region, already good enough on the water to take advantage of that marine superhighway? That's where the story jumps back across the ocean, to what people were doing long before anyone set foot in the New World. If people were going to ride this kelp-backed coastline into the Americas, they needed more than legs. They needed some way to get off the beach. That doesn't mean Polynesian-style blue water voyages. Nobody is arguing that the first Americans were setting out on 1,000-mile open ocean crossings, navigating by stars and swell patterns across empty horizons. Coastal migration demands something much humbler and, in some ways, more impressive. The ability to move confidently through a messy, broken shoreline world. Short crossings of bays and inlets, hopping from one island to the next. Working around cliffs where there is literally no beach to walk on. Ferrying people, kids, dogs, gear, meat and firewood from one good camp to the next one along the coast. That kind of movement implies watercraft, not hypothetically. Practically, the problem is boats rot. Skin stretches, wood warps, plant fibres decay. You can drop a stone point on the ground and find it 15,000 years later. You leave a kayak pulled up above the tide line, and a couple of seasons of sun, salt and freeze-thaw will turn it back into a pile of unremarkable trash. Give it 10,000 years and a rising sea, and whatever's left ends up buried under meters of sediment offshore. So when archaeologists talk about ancient boats, we usually aren't talking about the boats themselves. We're talking about an invisible technology that we have to reconstruct from everything around it. To see why a coastal route into the Americas isn't a wild stretch, you have to zoom out and look at what humans were doing on the water long before anyone reached Beringia. We know, for example, that by around 65,000 years ago, people had made it to Australia. There was never a land bridge from Southeast Asia to Sahul, the combined landmass of Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, during the relevant time windows. Even at the lowest glacial sea levels, you're looking at a series of islands, separated by water channels, tens of kilometres wide. Nobody thinks those crossings happened by accident, blown out to sea on storm debris with a full breeding population intact. The simplest explanation is intentional water travel using some kind of boat or raft, repeated enough times to establish viable populations. We see similar patterns in the Mediterranean. By at least 130,000 years ago, there are stone tools on islands like Crete and Naxos that were never connected to the mainland, even during maximum glaciation. Somebody, whether Neanderthals, early Homo sapiens, or some other hominin, was crossing salt water that you cannot wade. Jump forward again, and the evidence piles up. By 50,000 to 45,000 years ago, humans have reached islands across island Southeast Asia. By 38,000 or so, people are on Japan's Ryukyu Islands. By 30,000, they're exploiting the Channel Islands off California. Over and over the same pattern. Human populations turning up in places you only reach if you can move over water on purpose. None of this tells us exactly what those boats looked like. It does tell us that by the time populations were spreading around the northern Pacific Rim, the baseline human toolkit already included things you can float on. So what kind of watercraft are we realistically talking about for a coastal migration into the Americas? You don't need giant log canoes or intricate plank-built vessels. A simple dugout, one big tree hollowed by controlled burning and stone adzes, can carry several adults, a load of gear and meat. A frame of driftwood or light poles covered with stitched hides, seal, sea lion, maybe even large terrestrial mammals inland, gives you a skin boat that's light, fast and repairable. Bundles of logs or thick reeds lashed together can make serviceable rafts for ultra-short crossings in calm water. All of those are within reach of late Ice Age technology. Stone blades and scrapers shaped by hours of work. Twisted plant fibres or animal sinew as cordage. Bone awls and needles for punching and sewing hide. Fire as a shaping tool. None of that is speculative. We find all of those things in late Pleistocene toolkits. The navigation side doesn't require magic either. If you're a coastal people, you don't point your boat into featureless open water and hope. You hug the land, you move where you can see the shoreline nearly all the time. You learn the rhythm of local winds, the daily tides, which headlands create nasty currents, which bays shelter you from storms. Over generations. That knowledge hardens into culture. Certain points become known crossing places. From this cove you go when the wind is like this. You don't go when the swell comes from there. Children grow up hearing stories about the canoe that tried the wrong channel and never came back. Knowledge is not abstract. It is attached to specific rocks, islands and currents. And people manage risk. You don't load everyone into one boat and sprint into the unknown. You scout. A couple of skilled paddlers make a test run across a narrow channel on a calm day. If they find an island with good water and food, they return and report. Maybe the whole group relocates in a series of shuttles. Maybe only part of the group moves and maintains ties back across the water. A human bridge that can move information and genes in both directions. Weather windows become a core planning tool. You wait for stable high-pressure systems for mornings when the wind is down and the sea is glassy. You accept that some days you are shore-bound, feeding on shellfish and kelp, and watching the whitecaps, because the next safe headland is one bad decision too far. Catching is another part of the system. Prehistoric coastal people don't just show up empty-handed to a new site. They leave tools, spare paddles, fire starters, maybe even emergency food stashes at key stops along their normal range. That way, if a boat goes missing or a storm forces you to land early, you're not starting from zero. Archaeologically, we sometimes see this in odd concentrations of tools or raw materials in places that aren't full-time camps, possible echoes of those old safety nets. Because boats disappear, we infer all this from indirect traces. We see obsidian, shells and other materials moving across stretches of water that would be irrational to swim regularly. We find early sites on islands and offshore promontories that only make sense if people had reliable access by boat. We find woodworking tools polished and worn in ways consistent with hollowing and shaping wet timber. We see harpoons, fish hooks, net weights, and fish weirs in the record long before metal or wheels show up. We also have a modern control group, recent indigenous societies all along the North Pacific coast who, before colonization, used an astonishing variety of small craft to own their shorelines. Dugouts, skin boats, double-ended paddled craft, often built with stone and bone tools no more advanced in principle than what late Ice Age people had. Could late Pleistocene groups in Northeast Asia and Beringia have lacked boats entirely, while their cousins elsewhere were reaching islands and fishing intensively? It's possible in a strict logical sense, but you'd be betting against the broader pattern of human behaviour. The more parsimonious view is that by the time people were in position to approach the Americas from the northwest, they were already at least small boat competent, able to build simple craft, paddle them safely in nearshore waters, and teach the next generation how to do it. Once you grant that baseline, the coastal route stops looking like an outlandish maritime stunt. It starts to look like an extension of what humans were already doing around much of the world, using modest boats and deep local knowledge to turn rugged, kelp-lined coasts from barriers into pathways. And along one particular stretch of that pathway, in a cold, sprawling subcontinent called Beringia, people may have paused long enough to become something new. When most of us hear Bering Land Bridge, we picture a narrow neck of dirt between Siberia and Alaska, a frozen hallway that people just hustled across on their way to the real destination further south. But during the last Ice Age low sea level peak, Beringia wasn't a bridge. It was a country, a huge one. At maximum extent, the exposed shelf linked northeastern Asia to northwestern North America in a continuous block of land more than 1,000 kilometers wide. Sea level had dropped so far that the modern Bering Strait, plus big chunks of what are now the East Siberian, Chukchi and Bering Seas, turned into dry ground. It wasn't empty either. It was its own ecosystem. Instead of dense forests or endless bare ice, much of Beringia was a kind of steppe tundra, sometimes called the Mammoth Steppe. Think cold, but not Antarctica cold. Grassy, sedgy plains interspersed with dwarf shrubs, patches of moss and lichen. A landscape that, in many places, could support big herds of grazing animals. Mammoth, horse, bison, caribou, saiga. Predators like wolves and big cats following along. A frozen Serengeti stretched under a low, harsh sun. It wasn't uniform. Western Beringia, closer to Siberia, had its own mix of rivers, low hills and permafrost basins. Eastern Beringia, what's now interior Alaska and the Yukon, had different ice margins, different wind patterns, different plant communities. But taken together, this region was a refugium, a relatively stable pocket of livable land between the massive ice sheets to the east and the harsher Arctic seas and glaciated mountains elsewhere. And that's where the Beringian standstill idea comes in. The standstill hypothesis is an attempt to solve a puzzle in the genetics. When researchers look at the mitochondrial DNA and other genetic markers of indigenous peoples of the Americas, and compare them to populations in Northeast Asia, they see a pattern. The American lineages are clearly derived from Asian ancestors, but they're not just a random slice of modern Siberian diversity. They form their own cluster, with signs of having been isolated from their Asian cousins for a while before expanding into the rest of the Americas. In simple terms, the genetic story looks less like big Asian population, some folks step across the bridge, boom, everyone spreads south immediately, and more like smallish group separates from other Asians, hangs out somewhere for thousands of years, then part of that group explodes into the Americas. Where could they have been hanging out? Beringia is the obvious suspect, a big semi-productive refugium, sitting right between Asia and the ice sheets, available during key time windows, and then partly drowned again as sea level rose. The standstill hypothesis proposes that an ancestral American population became genetically distinct while living in or around Beringia, relatively cut off from both the main Asian populations behind them and the glaciated, hard-to-cross landscapes in front of them. That doesn't mean they were literally trapped on a tiny frozen island, staring wistfully at Canada for 10,000 years. It means that, in population genetic terms, gene flow between them and surrounding groups was limited enough, long enough, that their DNA started to drift in its own direction. Different models give different numbers, but many suggest something like 10 to 20,000 years of relative isolation somewhere in the north. Long enough for new lineages to form, long enough for certain mutations to become common simply because they happen to appear in that small, semi-closed population. Now, if you're thinking about a coastal route, that timing matters. If standstill-style isolation started before the last glacial maximum and extended into it, then the people who would eventually move down the Pacific coast weren't fresh arrivals sprinting across a brand new land bridge. They were the descendants of folks who had already been living in Beringia and its margins for many, many generations. In that scenario, the launch pad for the coastal dispersal isn't a random stretch of shoreline. It's the homeland of a population already adapted to northern extremes. People who knew this landscape, its animals, its plant cycles, its dangerous seasons intimately. People for whom the edge of the continent, sea ice and long winters were normal, because their grandparents and great-grandparents had been dealing with the same conditions. What does northern adaptation look like in this context? It's not just warm coats and big fires. It's a whole package of behavioural and maybe even genetic tweaks that make life in Beringia survivable. You learn how to track migratory herds across vast distances and time, your movements to match them. You figure out when river ice is load-bearing and when it's a death trap. You experiment with storing meat in frozen ground using permafrost as a natural freezer. You work out how to build shelters that can handle screaming winter winds, but can be taken down and moved when the herds move. You start relying heavily on animals perfectly tuned to these conditions. Caribou for meat, hides, sinew, maybe dogs for transport, hunting, and security. You pay attention to sea ice edges as seasonal hunting grounds, seals, seabirds, fish, concentrated along cracks and leads. A standstill population in Beringia would also have to master the slow-motion disasters of high latitudes. Winter darkness, spring floods, mosquito-choked summers that make big animals shift their behaviour. Unpredictable storms that can turn a decent day into a whiteout in an hour. All of this selects for flexibility, for deep environmental knowledge passed down in stories and taboos, for social networks that can move people between camps and groups when one area has a bad year. Those same skills and networks become incredibly handy when ice sheets start to pull back from the coast and new corridors, rocky, fjord-cut, kelp-rich, open to the south and east. From a coastal route perspective, the end of the standstill isn't a single moment when someone discovers an opening. It's more like a gradual relaxation of barriers. Glaciers thin and retreat from headlands. Summer sea ice pulls back from certain stretches of shore more reliably. New estuaries and bays appear, full of fish and shellfish. Each decade, the world along the edges gets a little bit easier. A Beringian population that already uses boats along rivers and nearshore waters, already tracks seasonal changes closely, already knows how to exploit both land and sea mammals, can start pushing feelers down these newly viable coasts. Not in one heroic migration wave, but in a slow generation-by-generation seep. Now, if people were living in Beringia for thousands of years, where's all the archaeology? This is where expectations have to meet reality. Small mobile groups scattered across a huge cold landscape don't leave big obvious cities in the dirt. They leave handfuls of flakes where someone napped a new blade. A few fire-cracked rocks where a hearth burned for a couple of nights. A thin scatter of bones, some with cut marks quickly scavenged by animals and broken up by freeze-thaw cycles. Then add time. Permafrost heaves and churns the ground. Wind erodes old surfaces and buries others under loess. Rivers braid and recut their channels, and along the continental shelf, the heart of that lost Beringian lowland, rising seas since the Ice Age have drowned tens of thousands of square kilometres of former campgrounds, kill sites, and travel routes under metres of water and sediment. We do have Beringian sites on the Siberian and Alaskan sides, late Pleistocene camps, kill sites, tool traditions that show people were absolutely there. But if you imagine a standstill population spread thinly over a supersized, partly submerged landscape, the sparse record starts to make more sense. We are, almost by definition, looking for needles in a haystack that's half underwater and half rearranged by ice. The genetics that inspired the standstill hypothesis don't get us off the hook either. They're powerful, but they're not precision instruments. Every genetic estimate of when American ancestors split from Asian relatives or how long they stayed relatively isolated depends on assumptions, how fast mutations accumulate, how big the ancestral populations were, how much they interbred with neighbours, which modern groups best reflect ancient diversity. Change those parameters and your date ranges slide around. So when you hear that the Beringian standstill lasted X thousand years between Y and Z, treat that as a model, not a timestamp. Geneticists usually give ranges, often wide ones, and many will tell you outright that different datasets point to slightly different histories. What almost all of them agree on, though, is the broad outline. The ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas spent a significant stretch of time somewhere in the far north, becoming genetically distinct before their descendants radiated across two continents. Whether that somewhere was strictly the exposed land bridge, a wider Beringian region including coastal and interior refugia, or a patchwork of northern habitats, it frames how we think about the coastal route. The people moving down those cold Pacific shores weren't just random wanderers from temperate Asia. They were very likely northerners, Beringians, bringing with them a deep toolkit for surviving Ice Age extremes. And as they moved out of that standstill homeland, they met a new kind of bottleneck, not of genes, but of geography, the harsh glaciated maze of the North Pacific coast itself. So what did that glaciated maze actually look like? If you trace a line from the Aleutians past the Alaska Peninsula, along the Gulf of Alaska, through southeast Alaska and the British Columbia coast, all the way down toward what's now Washington and Oregon, you're not looking at one simple shoreline. You're looking at a jigsaw of mountain ranges, drowned valleys and ice. During the coldest parts of the last glacial cycle, huge chunks of that coast were pinned under outlet glaciers, pouring down from interior ice sheets. Think long tongues of ice filling deep valleys right out to the sea, with cliff-like ice faces where the glacier met the water. In places, there wasn't really a beach at all, just rock, vertical ice, and cold ocean. That's the core of the coastal barrier argument. Skeptics of the coastal route point to maps of maximum ice extent and say, look, this wasn't a gentle seaside stroll. You had the Cordilleran ice sheet slamming into the Pacific along much of British Columbia, the Laurentide to the east, Alaskan glaciers to the north. Even if people were thriving in Beringia, how exactly were they supposed to thread their way through this mess? To answer that, coastal route proponents talk about something a little less intuitive than a clean corridor, mosaics of opportunity. Instead of imagining one continuous, perfectly ice-free highway running from Alaska to Chile, they picture a patchwork of refugia, local pockets of land and nearshore water that stayed relatively clear of ice, or at least seasonally usable. Some of these refugia would have been outer islands, sticking up beyond the reach of big valley glaciers. Others might have been headlands and rocky capes where ice sheets thinned out and broke up before hitting the open ocean. Still others were low-lying stretches between major glacier outlets, places where only smaller local ice caps formed and retreated. Now add seasonality. Even in heavily glaciated coasts today, Greenland, parts of Arctic Canada, you can have windows of time each year when sea ice pulls back from the cliffs, when the weather is marginally less murderous, when coastal polynias, open water holes, form along the ice edge and concentrate life. Seals haul out, fish school, seabirds gather. For people who know how to move and hunt in that world, those seasonal openings aren't just passable. They're gold mines. The coastal corridor idea takes that logic and stretches it along the North Pacific. Maybe you don't need a 3,000-kilometre strip of perfect beach. Maybe what you need is a chain of reachable, resource-rich spots, spaced a few days or weeks of travel apart. Islands, inlets, fjord mouths, small embayments that open up each late spring or summer. In that kind of landscape, sea ice and storms become double-edged swords. On bad days, they're absolutely barriers. Heavy pack ice slamming against steep fjord walls can make landing a boat lethal. Katabatic winds pouring off glaciers can turn the sea into a blender. A small group caught in the wrong place at the wrong time could be finished in hours, but under the right conditions those same forces can help. Stable landfast ice, a solid sheet attached to the shore, can be a winter highway, letting people and dog sleds bypass broken rocky ground. Drift ice can act like a moving platform, allowing short hops between headlands or islands that would be impossible in open, pounding surf. Storm systems that are predictable enough can become part of a travel calendar. You don't leave then, you leave in the lull that always follows. And if you're already a Beringian population comfortable with river travel and nearshore paddling, it's not a huge conceptual leap to apply those skills to an ice-choked, fjord-cut coast. You don't need Polynesian outrigger tech to hug the shore. Time your moves to tides and winds, and dart from safe pocket to safe pocket. The sticking point isn't whether such a strategy is imaginable. It's when, exactly, it would have been possible. This is the key uncertainty in the North Pacific bottleneck. Timing. How early were substantial parts of the Alaskan and British Columbian coasts actually usable by humans? Did enough refugia link up into a functional chain before the interior ice-free corridor fully opened? Were there earlier, brief windows of opportunity that left little or no trace, followed by re-advance of ice that erased most of the evidence? Glaciologists, oceanographers and paleoecologists have been hammering at these questions for decades, and the answers are getting more detailed, but they're not all in perfect agreement. Some reconstructions suggest that major stretches of the outer Pacific coast, especially offshore island arcs and parts of southeast Alaska, began losing their heavy ice cover surprisingly early, even before the absolute peak of the last glacial maximum. Others put significant deglaciation later, after interior routes between the sheets might already have been opening up. Shift those deglaciation curves a few thousand years one way or the other, and the story changes. In one version, a mostly viable coastal chain appears just in time for a pre- or early LGM migration pulse. In another, the coast is too fragmented and brutal until after people could, in principle, have come through interior Canada. The good news is that this isn't a believe-what-you-want situation. It's testable, and it's getting tested. Every new radiocarbon date from ancient beach ridges, every layer of marine sediment pulled up from the continental shelf, every exposure of old glacial till on some remote island helps tighten the timelines. Pollen grains trapped in lake mud can tell us when tundra plants, shrubs, or even pockets of forest return to a valley. Diatoms and foraminifera, microscopic shells in seafloor cores, can reveal when waters warmed or freshened as ice pulled back. Driftwood on raised shorelines can give minimum ages for when those beaches were ice-free and above sea level. Put enough of these tiny local data points together, and you start to see which parts of the coast were plausibly habitable, when, and for how long. You can model where kelp forests likely grew, where upwelling made fisheries rich, which inlets might have been choked with calving ice, which stretches were perennial open water. We're still a long way from a perfectly resolved map. But the direction of travel is clear. The North Pacific bottleneck is not an unanswerable mystery. It's a moving boundary being pushed back year by year as paleo-environmental reconstructions sharpen. And every time that boundary shifts, the window of possibility for a coastal route shifts with it, reshaping how we think about those first Beringian explorers edging their way past the ice. So if parts of that coast were sometimes open, the obvious follow-up is, where are the people? If early travellers really threaded their way along this glaciated shoreline, they would have left things behind. Not stone cities or giant shell mounds right away, but the usual fingerprints of mobile foragers who know how to live off the sea. Think about what that actually means on the ground. You're expecting stone tools and the flakes from making them? Simple, portable lithics, bifaces, scrapers, small points or knives, maybe microblades later on. You're expecting hearths, patches of charcoal, reddened rock, maybe fire-cracked stones where people boiled water or cooked meat. You're expecting food debris, burned bone from marine mammals, fish, birds, shell from clams, mussels, limpets, chitons, maybe worked bone or antler, harpoon tips, barbed points, awls, fish gorges. In other words, the same general toolkit you see whenever humans move into rich coastal zones anywhere in the world. If a group paused for a night or two on a beach terrace 18,000 years ago, that's the kind of microscopic trash they'd leave behind. If they came back to the same protected bay year after year, generation after generation, those traces could build up into real archaeological sites. Thin, stratified lenses of dark soil, bone fragments, and flakes tucked into old dune ridges, or perched on ancient shorelines. So why don't we just go out, dig a few beaches, and call it a day? Because the northwest coast is one of the worst places on Earth for preserving exactly the stuff we care about most. For one thing, most of the ancient coastline isn't coastline anymore. Sea level was much lower during the last glacial maximum. Those nice flat shelf areas that would have made perfect camp spots are now under tens of meters of water. The paleo beach, where someone dried fish and sharpened a bone point, might now be a crabbing ground off Vancouver Island. On land, things aren't much kinder. A huge part of the modern northwest coast is temperate rainforest, thick, wet, acidic soils, constant biological activity, roots tearing through old layers, fungi, bacteria, and acidic groundwater chewing up bone and shell. Wood tools gone, leather, sinew, plant fibres gone. Even unburned bone can just dissolve. Shell, which in other regions can form massive, long-lived middens, often doesn't stand a chance if it's sitting in the wrong soil chemistry for a few thousand years. Now stir the whole thing with glaciers, landslides, and sea level change. As ice advanced and retreated, it bulldozed surfaces, dumped tons of sediment, dammed and released meltwater lakes. Post-glacial rebound, the land literally flexing upward after being freed from ice, has raised some old shorelines hundreds of meters above today's sea level. In other areas, subsidence and local sea level rise drowned them. River deltas migrated, hill slopes failed, storm waves ripped at the edges. All of that movement can bury, scatter, or outright erase the fragile traces of small short-term camps. So archaeologists have had to be strategic. You can't just randomly dig in a forest and hope to hit a 17,000-year-old beach party. Instead, they target places where the odds of preservation and visibility are better. One big focus is caves and rock shelters. These are natural sediment traps and roofed archives. If you can find a cave that was above sea level at the right time, close to ancient shorelines, and protected from glacial scouring, you've got a shot at finding preserved charcoal, bone and tools, layered like a stack of time-stamped pancakes. Some of the most important early sites in Alaska and British Columbia are exactly that, caves and rock shelters with deep stratigraphy, where tiny changes in sediment colour and texture mark thousands of years of human visits. Another strategy is to chase raised shorelines on land. Geologists map ancient beach ridges and marine terraces, flat benches cut by waves when sea level was at a different stand. Those benches become prime survey targets. If a particular terrace was a shoreline 16,000 years ago and now sits, say, 40 metres above modern sea level, archaeologists walk that contour looking for scatters of stone or dark, charcoal-rich soils. Where they see promising signals, they dig test pits, looking for intact layers. Then there are the islands. Island archaeology has become one of the most powerful tools for testing the coastal route, because islands often hold on to evidence the mainland loses. Many offshore islands were never fully overridden by thick ice sheets. They had their own smaller glaciers, or even stayed largely ice-free. That makes them potential refugia not just for plants and animals, but for people. Islands also tend to have more stable shorelines once big post-glacial adjustments settle down. They can preserve old beach ridges and caves in relatively undisturbed form, while nearby mainland valleys get hammered by rivers and landslides. Most importantly, islands sit right where we'd expect coastal travellers to linger, in the middle of that kelp highway. If people were leapfrogging along the outer coast, hopping from one food-rich pocket to another, outer archipelagos and headlands are natural waypoints. They offer predictable marine resources, bird colonies, sheltered landing spots, and vantage points for scanning the sea. So when archaeologists find early dates and repeated occupation in island caves or on old island beaches, that's not just an interesting local story. It's a hint that the route between Beringia and the Americas might have braided through those archipelagos. The last major frontier is underwater. Submerged continental shelves and drowned river mouths are where a lot of the original story probably sits. Teams now use sonar, sub-bottom profilers, and underwater coring to map ancient shorelines and look for buried paleosols, old land surfaces sealed beneath marine sediments. In a few places globally, that approach has already turned up submerged sites. On the northwest coast it's slower going, but the strategy is the same. Find old terrace edges, model where islands would have been during low sea level, then drag cameras and cores along those targets, and, when possible, send divers or ROVs. Underlying all of this is one unglamorous but absolutely critical thing: dating and stratigraphy. A flake by itself doesn't prove a coastal migration. A bone fragment with a cool radiocarbon age doesn't either, if you can't show exactly where it came from in the sediment stack and whether it's been moved. So coastal archaeologists obsess over context. They build tight stratigraphic profiles. They record every thin layer, every change from sand to silt to peat. They date not just one piece of charcoal, but multiple samples up and down a sequence. They cross-check radiocarbon with other methods where they can. Tephra layers from known volcanic eruptions, luminescence dates on sand grains, even ancient DNA from sediments. Because in the end, the coastal route rises or falls not on dramatic headlines, but on whether enough small, well-dated, securely stratified bits of evidence line up. We already have some of those bits on the northwest coast, sites that show people were there earlier than many once thought, using marine resources visiting islands, living in landscapes shaped by retreating ice. What we don't yet have is a dense, continuous chain of such sites running all the way back toward Beringia and deep into the last glacial cycle. That gap is where the debate lives, and it's exactly where the next section on what genetics can and can't tell us about roots picks up the trail. Archaeology gives us things you can hold in your hand. Genetics gives us clocks, not clocks in the sense of a neat little dial that reads Bering Land Bridge 15,000 years ago. More like a fuzzy stopwatch that's been dropped, reset and splashed with mud a few times, and we're trying to reconstruct what it says by staring at the gears. Here's the basic idea. Every generation DNA picks up new mutations. Most of them don't do much. They're just tiny spelling changes in a 3 billion letter instruction manual. If you compare two populations and count how many of these neutral differences they share versus how many are unique, you can estimate how long it's been since they had a common ancestor. That's the molecular clock. But that clock doesn't tick at exactly the same rate in every lineage, for every chunk of the genome, under every demographic scenario. Mutation rates can be estimated different ways, by comparing deep splits among primates, or by watching new mutations appear in modern family pedigrees, and those methods don't always agree. Population booms and busts can scramble the signal. Natural selection can speed up or slow down changes in particular genes. So when geneticists say, for example, that the ancestors of indigenous Americans split from their closest Siberian relatives around 25,000 years ago, that number isn't written in stone. It comes with error bars. Maybe it's 22,000. Maybe 28,000. Different models and datasets can nudge it earlier or later. That fuzziness matters a lot when you're arguing about whether people took an inland corridor that might have become biologically viable around 14,000 years ago, or a coastal route that could have been usable a few thousand years earlier. Even with all those caveats, some broad patterns are hard to ignore. When you look at the genomes of indigenous peoples across the Americas, one thing jumps out. For such a huge landmass, there is surprisingly tight genetic relatedness at deep time scales. Most Native American groups today trace back to a single major founding population, with later regional diversification layered on top. That pattern, plus the relative lack of really ancient, deeply diverged lineages inside the Americas, is exactly what you'd expect from a rapid initial expansion. A small source population enters a mostly empty continent, grows quickly, and spreads fast. There isn't a long period of slow, isolated evolution in one corner. There's a pulse. You can even see hints of that pulse in how genetic diversity is distributed. In many datasets, diversity tends to be a bit higher in the north and tapers off toward the southern tip of South America. That serial founder pattern, new groups budding off from previous ones as they move farther and farther away, is consistent with a wave of people moving quickly southward. All of that fits beautifully with a coastal expressway, where rich marine resources grease the wheels of long-distance travel. But, and this is the key point, it doesn't prove a coastal expressway, because you can write inland stories that also fit those same genetic facts. Imagine a world where people linger in Beringia or nearby for thousands of years, then pour south as soon as a viable corridor opens. If that expansion is fast enough and starts from an already bottlenecked population, the genetic signature can look similar. One major founding group, then a rapid radiation and a gradient of diversity. Tweaking the timing and structure of that Beringian standstill can make different route scenarios compatible with the same genetic data. Maybe there were multiple pulses out of the north. One early group hugging the coast, another later one using an interior passage. Maybe there were people on the landscape south of the ice before the big expansion, but they got genetically swamped by later arrivals. Purely from modern DNA, those histories can blur together. That's why arguments that sound like the genomes say it must have been the coast, or the genomes say it must have been the corridor, are usually overselling it. The data are real, the interpretations are models laid on top. Where genetics really starts to bite is when you add time-stamped individuals, ancient DNA. Instead of just comparing modern populations and working backward, you suddenly have real people pinned to specific places and dates. A child buried in Alaska 11,500 years ago. A person living in central Mexico 10,000 years ago. Remains from the Andes, from the southern cone, from the eastern woodlands. You can sequence those genomes and ask, how are they related to each other and to living indigenous peoples? Do they fall inside the same major founding lineage? Do they show signs of additional gene flow from elsewhere? Do they preserve branches that later went extinct? Ancient DNA from Beringia has revealed groups like the ancient Beringians, who seem to represent an early northern branch that later got absorbed or replaced. South American ancient genomes show that people were living thousands of kilometers apart very early, confirming that the rapid expansion wasn't just a theoretical curve on a graph, it actually happened on the ground. Those ancient genomes act like calibration points on the molecular clock. They constrain how early the split between Asian and American ancestors must have been, how long people could have been isolated in Beringia, and how quickly populations spread once they got south of the ice. But notice what they still don't do. A genome doesn't come with a built-in GPS track. You can't look at a 12,000-year-old skeleton from Brazil and read off coastal route or ice-free corridor from their chromosomes. What you see is ancestry relationships and timing. The physical routes people used between those points are still a geographical and archaeological problem. You can sometimes infer something about routes when you see genetic signals that line up with particular ecologies. For example, extra bits of ancestry in certain coastal or island groups that look like later contacts along a seaway, or distinct lineages in the interior that suggest long separation. But again, multiple migration paths can produce similar mosaics, especially after thousands of years of movement and intermarriage. So genetics gives us, yes, there was a small founding population. Yes, it diverged from Asian relatives, roughly in the window when Beringia existed. Yes, the spread through the Americas was fast in evolutionary terms. What it doesn't give us, at least not yet, is a single clean line on the map labelled the route. And that's the real danger, turning messy, probabilistic genetic inferences into a simple hero's journey. One migration, one date, one passageway. Human history almost never works that way. The genetic record of the Americas is already hinting at complexity. Possible early branches that didn't leave many descendants, later waves of movement in the north, local population turnovers, layers of interaction after the initial peopling. The more ancient DNA we recover from the far north, from early coastal sites, from the interior plains and mountains, the more tangled the picture is likely to get, not less. And that's a good thing. Tangled means real. The job, then, isn't to let genetics crown a single winner, coast or corridor, but to use those DNA clocks and ancient individuals as constraints. They tell us which archaeological stories are even plausible, which timelines are too tight, which scenarios require migrations faster than any human group could realistically pull off. And once you start combining those genetic constraints with the physical traces of tools and camps, another line of evidence slides in that's just as revealing: technology itself. If genetics is the stopwatch, technology is the fingerprints on the crime scene. When archaeologists argue about coastal versus interior routes, they're not just drawing lines on a blank map. They're asking, what kinds of tools would people actually need to live in those environments? And do we see those tools where and when we'd expect them? In principle, that sounds straightforward. A coastal-oriented group should leave behind a different functional signature than one that's focused on big game in the continental interior. If you're hugging shorelines and estuaries, your survival kit leans toward marine and aquatic resources. You want ways to catch, process, and store fish and sea mammals. So archaeologists look for things like barbed bone or antler points that make good harpoons, grooved stones that might have served as net weights, shell and bone tools used for scaling, filleting, and scraping fish, grinding stones caked with residues from seaweed or shellfish. On the interior plains, in contrast, the classic Ice Age image is people targeting large land mammals, bison, mammoths, horses, later deer and elk. There you expect big, sturdy spear points, butchering tools optimized for hide scraping and dismembering large carcasses, more generalized hunting and gathering gear that can handle a wide range of terrestrial foods. Lay those two extremes side by side and it sounds like a neat diagnostic contrast. Maritime toolkit versus interior big game toolkit. So why is this still controversial? Because nature and time are not neat. Coastal tools are often made of the worst stuff for long-term preservation. Wood for spear shafts and fish traps, plant fibres for nets and lines, lightweight composite points with bone barbs and sinew binding. All of that rots, burns or dissolves long before we show up with trowels. Even the coastlines themselves have moved. The shore people used 16,000 or 18,000 years ago is now dozens of metres underwater. The best equipped maritime camps might currently be buried in seafloor sediments, along with the clearest evidence of harpoons, fish weirs and net floats. So what we actually get, especially on the earliest sites, is the hard, stubborn stuff. Stone. That's where things get tricky. A lot of stone tools are multitaskers. A sharp flake can cut fish meat or caribou hide. A scraper can clean a seal skin or a deer skin. A small pointed blade can tip an arrow for waterfowl or for pronghorn. In other words, a generalized foraging toolkit might work reasonably well in both coastal and interior settings, especially for highly mobile groups who need flexibility more than hyper-specialization. You might see a camp full of simple flakes, scrapers, and points, and have no way, just from the stone, to tell whether those people spent most of their time chasing salmon or stalking bison. Still, archaeologists do see patterns later in time. Once sea levels stabilize a bit and preservation gets kinder, coastal groups around the North Pacific and North Atlantic clearly develop specialized maritime gear. Complex harpoons with toggling heads, abundant fish hooks, net sinkers and shell tools. Evidence of mass fish processing, like dense piles of bones from specific runs. That tells us something important. Humans are absolutely capable of building highly specialized marine toolkits when they're deeply invested in coastal economies. The big question for the peopling of the Americas is, how early did that specialization start, and does any of it show up in the earliest layers? So far the answer is maybe, but not cleanly. Some early sites along the northwest coast and further south show heavy use of marine resources, fish bones, shell middens, sea mammal remains, but the stone tools themselves look pretty generalized. Simple flakes, bifaces, scrapers. You can read that two ways. Either these are inland-style foragers who are opportunistically hitting the coast, or these are coastal specialists whose perishable gear isn't surviving, so all we see is the generic stone part of a much richer toolkit. This is where people start bringing in things like microblades. Microblades are tiny, standardized stone blades struck from prepared cores and set into handles or shafts. You see them in Siberia and Beringia. You see related traditions in parts of northwest North America, and they've often been linked to high mobility. a system where you carry a few carefully shaped cores and pop off replacement blades as needed, instead of lugging a big pile of finished tools. On paper, that sounds perfect for a fast, long-distance migration along a rugged coast, light, efficient, flexible. But there are big caveats. Microblade technologies appear at different times in different regions. Some of the best documented microblade complexes in North America are probably too late to represent the very first entry into the continent. And microblades aren't inherently coastal or interior. They show up in cold inland settings, in uplands, and in areas with no obvious maritime focus at all. They're a mobility strategy, not a GPS tag. So archaeologists treat microblades and similar traditions as hints about how people moved and organized their technology, not direct markers of a coastal migration. They're one more piece in a jigsaw puzzle with a lot of missing edges. That same caution applies to a bigger concept you'll often hear in these debates: lithic continuity versus lithic discontinuity. Lithics just means stone tools. Lithic continuity is when tool traditions in one region look like they evolve smoothly out of older traditions nearby. You get a chain of resemblance over time and space. Discontinuity is when a new toolkit suddenly appears in the record with no obvious local ancestors. Different shapes, different production techniques, different logic. If you see continuity between Northeast Asia, Beringia, and early sites in the Americas, that can support the idea of gradual spread, maybe through a corridor, with people bringing and tweaking an inland hunting toolkit. If, instead, early coastal sites show a very different style from what's sitting just inland at the same time, that might suggest a separate route or a different source population, a coastal stream of migrants that didn't heavily mix with interior groups right away. But again, we're dealing in tendencies, not smoking guns. Similar problems can produce similar solutions. If two unrelated groups in different regions are both trying to butcher large animals efficiently, they may independently invent very similar bifacial spear points. If multiple mobile groups are facing frequent tool breakage and limited high-quality stone, they may all converge on prepared core technologies or microblade-like strategies. Convergence cuts both ways. Apparent continuity might just be separate groups arriving at similar designs. Apparent discontinuity might reflect a shift in available rock types or in prey animals, not a new migration. So technology absolutely matters for the coastal versus interior debate. Toolkits tell us what people were doing, how they were solving day-to-day problems, what kinds of environments they were comfortable in. But the tools don't come with labels saying used on a kelp-rich shoreline or carried through the ice-free corridor. We have to infer roots from patterns in time, space, and function, and then hold those in tension with what genetics, geology, and paleoecology are all saying. When you line those pieces up, some early sites start to stand out, not because they single-handedly prove a route, but because their age, location, and technology make certain paths more plausible than others. Those are the sites we'll turn to next. When somebody claims they found the earliest site in the Americas, archaeologists don't just look at the headline date and go, "Nice new record." They reach for a mental checklist. First question: context. Are those stone flakes actually sitting in the layer that's being dated, or did they wash down from somewhere else? Are the bones with cut marks really from the same event, or were they dragged around by roots, burrowing animals, or flowing water? Is the layer disturbed, tilted, mixed? Archaeology is merciless on this point. A gorgeous spear point that's clearly early in style, but found in a jumbled layer with younger stuff, is basically a lost object. Interesting, but not a solid data point for timing. Second question, dating. How do we know how old that layer is? Radiocarbon? On what material? Charcoal from a hearth in clear association with tools is good. Charcoal from a root channel that might have snuck in later is not. Bone dates need to be checked against contamination. Sediment dates like OSL or luminescence have their own pitfalls. Were the grains last exposed to light when people were actually there, or during some later disturbance? The strongest sites throw multiple methods at the problem. If radiocarbon on bone, radiocarbon on charcoal, and independent dating of the sediment all line up, confidence goes way up. If there's just one weird date and everything else points younger, archaeologists get suspicious. Third question. Artifacts. Are we looking at a clear human toolkit, or could natural processes have created those flakes? Repeated, patterned blows on a core, consistent angles, use wear on edges. That's human. A few broken rocks with no pattern and no other signs of occupation. Could be geology playing tricks. And last, taphonomy. That's the fancy word for everything that happens to remains after they enter the ground. Bones get chewed by carnivores, etched by roots, cracked by freezing and thawing. Stones get rolled, trampled, chipped by falling rocks. Under a microscope, a cut mark from a stone tool looks very different from a gnaw mark from a rodent or a crack from weathering. Good early sites have detailed taphonomic studies that say, yes, these alterations match human activity, and no, they're not just natural damage. Once a site survives that gauntlet, then it can start to matter for migration routes. Take Monteverde in southern Chile. For a long time, the idea that people were down there around 14,500 years ago was wildly controversial. It's far south. It's early. It's nowhere near the classic Clovis heartland in North America. But Monteverde had exactly what skeptics demand. Well-preserved features, clear stratigraphy, carefully dated organic material, and a coherent set of artifacts in place. After years of independent scrutiny, most researchers now accept it as a real pre-Clovis occupation. What does that do to the route debate? It doesn't tell you coastal route, case closed, but it crushes one version of the corridor story, the one where people only enter the Americas after 13,000 years ago, sprint south, and invent Clovis as they go. If humans are already living in southern Chile, with a decent tool tradition and knowledge of local resources by roughly 14,500 years ago, then either they teleported, which is unlikely, or they started moving into the hemisphere earlier than we used to think, and they had a way around or past the great northern ice sheets before the classic corridor fully opened. That way around doesn't have to be a purely coastal migration, but suddenly a Pacific shoreline route looks much more plausible. Now look north. Sites like the Cooper's Ferry area in Idaho or Paisley Caves in Oregon are inland, but they're showing human presence in the 14,000 to maybe 15,000 plus years ago window, depending on which dates you accept. The tools there aren't Clovis. They don't have the big classic fluted points that used to define first Americans in textbooks. They're more generalized, more variable. You can read that a couple of ways. One is that an interior route was viable slightly earlier than we once thought. Another is that people who initially travelled along coasts and river mouths were already probing inland corridors, following salmon runs and big game up valleys. From the perspective of a coastal route argument, those early inland sites are like shadows on the wall. If you see humans established in interior river basins very soon after the ice sheets start retreating, and maybe even before a wide grassy corridor existed, that suggests the earliest stream of migrants didn't depend solely on that interior highway. They might have come in along the coast, then peeled inland wherever opportunities opened, estuaries, large rivers, ice-free pockets. Even a single strong site can shift probabilities. Before Monteverde, it was relatively easy to keep everything inside a 13,000-year-ago corridor plus Clovis model. After Monteverde, any model that insists on no people here before X date has to explain away a well-documented occupation thousands of kilometres to the south. The same applies in a subtler way to newer claims like potential footprints in New Mexico, or very early tools in central Mexico, or at Bluefish Caves in the Yukon. Some of these are still hotly debated, and not all will survive long-term scrutiny. But if even one of the older proposed sites, say something genuinely solid at 18,000 or 20,000 years ago, passes the full context dating artifact taphonomy test, it pushes back the minimum time window for entry and makes a coastal or mixed strategy far more likely than a late single interior surge. There's a catch, though. The earliest people who took a coastal route don't have to leave their clearest footprints on the coast. Remember, sea level rise has erased huge stretches of their real shoreline. What we see instead are the places where those descendants intersected environments that do preserve caves, lake margins, river terraces, often a bit inland. So an early inland site with hints of marine resources or with technologies that link back to North Pacific or Northeast Asian traditions can be indirect evidence that some coastal adapted group passed through earlier. That's why archaeologists obsess over a handful of key early sites, argue over every date and broken bone, and yet keep using words like suggests, likely, and consistent with instead of proves. Each good site tightens the constraints on any migration model. It tells you by this time, in this place, people were already here doing these things. Stack enough of those constraints together, and some routes start to look very cramped, while others, like a flexible, resource-rich coastal pathway, start to look like the path of least resistance. If people really were able to move around the North Pacific edge before the classic ice-free corridor was friendly, the next question is obvious. How fast could they go? Not sprinting down the beach fast. Demographic fast. How quickly can families, pregnancies, toddlers, grandparents, and all their stuff ratchet themselves down a coastline that actually wants them there? Archaeologists think about this in terms of expansion fronts and leapfrogging. Imagine a small founding population somewhere around coastal Beringia or the Gulf of Alaska. They're not a single camp. They're multiple bands linked by marriage and sharing. Each year, some households split off. A young couple argues with their in-laws, or a camp gets a bit too crowded, or a salmon run fails. They walk or paddle a little farther than the usual round of known coves and river mouths and try a new spot. If that new spot has good fresh water, shellfish beds, driftwood, and a sheltered landing, they stick around longer next time. Maybe they overwinter. They're not pioneers in the heroic sense. They're just doing what humans always do, pushing the edges of their comfort zone a little, then normalizing it. Over generations, this produces what modelers call a wave of advance. The population behind grows, fissions, and constantly seeds new camps at the edge. Out at the very front, numbers are low, but mobility is high. There's lots of empty coastline, lots of unclaimed coves. People can afford to pick and choose. Now layer in leapfrogging. On a resource-rich coast, the best habitats aren't evenly spaced. One stretch might be rocky and storm-blasted with few landing spots. Another, 100 or 200 kilometers away, might have a big estuary, a river full of salmon, tidal flats crawling with shellfish, and a nice back barrier lagoon. If your group already has boats and knows how to read the sea, you don't have to occupy every marginal bay in between. You can jump. A party can scout far ahead in summer, find an incredible estuary, and then the next year, a whole family cluster can relocate there, effectively skipping over hundreds of kilometers of less attractive coast. Over time, that creates a string of pearls along the shore, high-quality nodes separated by long, lightly used stretches. This is where coastal travel can absolutely outpace interior trekking. Inland, you're walking. You're dealing with tangled forests, broken terrain, ice-dammed lakes, bogs and seasonal bottlenecks. You can't carry as much food unless you have animals or watercraft on rivers. You have to learn new plant communities and game behaviour in every drainage you enter. A cautious interior expansion rate might be on the order of a few kilometres per generation, on average, once you factor in backtracking, failures and local die-offs. On a coast, if you're already comfortable with skin boats or dugouts, you can cover tens of kilometres in a day under good conditions. You're following a linear highway where key resources repeat. Kelp beds, fish runs, seabirds, shellfish, driftwood. You don't need to reinvent your subsistence strategy every time you round a headland. You tweak it. That doesn't mean a family in Alaska just takes off and shows up in Chile 3 summers later. Life doesn't work like that. People have children. Elders slow down. Weather strands you. You have to learn local tides, new storm patterns, new dangerous reefs. But even with those constraints, demographic models that plug in realistic hunter-gatherer birth rates and modest annual movements along a productive coast routinely produce numbers that surprise people. A few hundred to maybe 1,000 kilometres of net range expansion per century at the front edge isn't outrageous. Stretch that over 1,500 or 2,000 years, and you're looking at the possibility of reaching mid or even far South America from the far north, while leaving plenty of time for pauses, setbacks, and local adaptations along the way. The key is that these movements aren't one way. They're built on staging areas and seasonal rounds. A staging area is a place that's so good, people keep coming back, year after year, generation after generation. Think big salmon river mouths, major shellfish beds, rich lagoons, river-lake systems. These hubs anchor regional mobility. From a staging area, groups might fan out seasonally, up rivers for salmon, inland for berries and large game, along the shore for sea mammals or bird rookeries. Then they reconverge, stories move, marriage partners swap camps. News about that bay 2 days south where the clams are huge circulates. Return mobility matters for speed. It means the frontier isn't just a fragile line of outposts. It's constantly resupplied with people, mates and information from behind. If a far-flung camp has a bad year, survivors can retreat to a known staging area. If a new pocket turns out to be amazing, word of that flows back, and more people choose to shift their seasonal round to include it. The whole system behaves less like a slow, cautious march, and more like a pulsing network. Now, if people can move that fast, why don't we see dense stair-steps of sites, one after another, marching down the coast? This is where archaeologists start talking about signal versus noise. The signal is the true pattern of past human presence. Every campfire, every cached tool, every butchery site, every shelter. The noise is everything that scrambles or erases that pattern before we ever get a chance to see it. Sea level rise drowning ancient beaches, storms eroding sites, earthquakes dropping terraces into the ocean, later occupations chewing up earlier ones, and the simple fact that we've only dug tiny fractions of the coast that still exist. Add sampling bias on top. We look where there are roads, where modern coastlines make it easy, where funding and land access cooperate. We haven't mapped, let alone excavated, most of the continental shelf that was dry land 16,000 years ago. So even if a fast coastal expansion really happened, the archaeological expectation is not a neat, continuous dotted line of camps from Alaska to Patagonia. It's a thin, ragged scatter, a few early sites here, a few there, often inland, where caves and lake shores preserve better than beaches do. Speed models actually predict sparse early visibility. If people are moving quickly past huge stretches of coast, only a tiny subset of potential camps get used heavily enough, or long enough, to leave big, obvious archaeological footprints. Many front-edge camps might be used for a handful of seasons and then abandoned as families shift to a better cove down the line. Those light, short-term occupations are the easiest for geology to erase and the hardest for us to detect. That's why archaeologists don't panic when early sites look weirdly far apart in space or time. Given a fast hop-by-hop plus leapfrog coastal spread, plus sea level rise and patchy preservation, a sparse, noisy record is exactly what you'd expect, and it sets the stage for the next question. Once those fast-moving coastal bands existed, how, and how quickly, did some of them pivot inland and start filling the vast interior of the continents? The first thing to understand is that coast and interior aren't two separate worlds with a hard line between them. They're connected by corridors. If you stand on almost any stretch of temperate Pacific coastline and look inland, the landscape is not just a solid wall of mountains or forest. It's a series of gateways, river valleys that cut deep into the ranges, broad estuaries that turn into long, gentle floodplains, low passes where ice pulled back first and plants came in early. Transitional zones, ecotones, where marine and inland ecosystems overlap. Those are the on-ramps from the Kelp Highway into the continental road network. Rivers are the obvious ones. A salmon river mouth is an incredible coastal resource, but it's also a ready-made inland travel corridor. Follow that river upstream in spring and fall, and you're basically walking on a conveyor belt of food and fresh water. Salmon runs, beaver, waterfowl, riparian berries, moose or deer in the floodplains. If your group already moves seasonally between different coastal spots, adding a go-up-river for part of the year loop is not a radical lifestyle change. It's one more extension of the seasonal round, and the first pushes inland probably looked exactly like that. Not a decision to leave the coast, but a gradual thickening of inland use around really good river systems. Now add in mountain passes and interior basins. During deglaciation, not every valley was equally choked with ice. Some corridors opened earlier than others, especially where glaciers were thin, or where warming climate carved out tongues of tundra and shrubland between ice masses. From the coast, those would have looked like fingers of new habitat reaching into the unknown interior. These ecotonal zones where marine influence meets open shrub, grass, or parkland are biological candy stores. You get marine fish and shellfish, plus terrestrial grazers, waterfowl, freshwater and rich plant communities all stacked in a relatively narrow band. To a coastal hunting fishing group, that's an invitation. So why not just stay put and enjoy coast plus lower river? Why bother pushing deeper inland at all? Several big incentives show up again and again in hunter-gatherer ethnography and archaeology. One is megafauna, large game, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, big Pleistocene bison and horses, weren't lined up neatly along the surf zone. Many of them preferred open interior grasslands, steppe or park tundra. If your group notices huge animals wandering in the distance, or hears stories from relatives who followed a river farther than usual and saw herds on the plains, curiosity and hunger start pulling in that direction. A single successful mammoth kill can feed a band for a long time, provide tons of bone and ivory for tools, and elevate the status of skilled hunters. Even if your everyday diet is still salmon and shellfish, the draw of those interior herds is enormous. Another motive is fresh water security. Coastal life is great until it isn't. Droughts, shifts in upwelling, changes in storm tracks can wreck shellfish beds or alter nearshore fish communities. River systems, lakes, and inland wetlands offer alternative water and food sources when a local stretch of coast goes bad. Groups that already have upriver camps are buffered against these shocks. When things go sideways on the shore, the backup becomes the main base. Then there's stone. good nappable rock, obsidian, high-quality chert, fine-grained basalt isn't uniformly sprinkled along the beaches. Some of the best sources are inland: river gravels, glacial outwash fans, bedrock outcrops in mountain foothills. If your toolkit still depends heavily on stone points, scrapers and blades, discovering a major inland quarry is like finding a gas station, hardware store and armory in one place. People will travel a long way for superior raw material, and once they're making regular visits, short-term quarry trips can morph into longer inland stays, then into semi-permanent interior camps. Put all of that together and you don't need a dramatic abandon the sea scenario. You just need a few generations of coastal families whose seasonal rounds creep farther up certain rivers, linger longer in certain passes, start hunting certain interior herds more reliably, and suddenly you have something new: interior traditions growing from coastal roots. This can happen shockingly fast in cultural terms. Imagine a coastal-focused group that spends 2 months of the year upriver hunting caribou or bison. Within a couple of generations, some sublineages might decide they prefer that lifestyle: less storm exposure, more big game, familiar wintering spots away from tidal hazards. They start wintering inland more consistently. They experiment with different camping patterns: wind-sheltered ridges instead of beaches, lakeside spots instead of estuaries. They revise their toolkits: heavier projectile points for big animals, more hide processing tools, different storage strategies for inland winters. If daughters from those inland-leaning families still marry back into more coastal families, ideas and genes flow both ways. But the day-to-day habits, the local knowledge, the "this is how we do things here" culture of that subgroup begins to diverge. Archaeologically, this shows up as distinct traditions, one with more shell middens, bone tools for fishing and generalized points, another with more inland kill sites, specialized big game points, different hearth layouts, maybe different pigments or ornaments. You don't have to invent those interior traditions from scratch. You spin them off from a coastal base, and that's how a coastal entry can still be fully compatible with the later picture we actually see. Widespread inland cultures stretching across the Great Plains, the interior West, the Amazon, the eastern woodlands. In one scenario, a wave of people moves quickly along the North Pacific and down the Americas' outer margins. From dozens of key estuaries, river mouths, and low passes, smaller waves peel inland at different times. Some of those inland explorations fail. Groups get trapped by ice, hit poor habitat, or simply get absorbed back into coastal networks. Others hit ecological jackpots: huge herds, rich riverine corridors, productive lake chains. Those become new staging areas, anchoring fresh interior expansions that have their own internal logic, their own regional identities. From the outside, thousands of years later, it can look like two separate processes: a coastal mystery tradition we barely see, and robust inland traditions we know well. In reality, they may be branches of the same tree. So what would it take to actually prove that connection, rather than just telling a nice story about it? Archaeologists talk about linkage across space and time. One kind of linkage is technological. If you can show that very early inland sites share distinctive tool types, manufacturing techniques, or raw material movement patterns with slightly older, or equally old, coastal or near-coastal sites, that's a strong hint they're part of the same cultural network. Think of a specific way of making projectile points, particular flaking scars, base shapes, or thinning strategies that shows up at a river mouth and then appears, with only minor tweaks, 500 kilometers upriver. Or the same peculiar bone harpoon style appearing in both a coastal lagoon and a far inland lake on the same drainage. That's not random convergence, that's transmission. Another kind of linkage is raw material sourcing. If obsidian or chert from a known coastal or near-coastal source shows up far inland at early sites, you've just mapped a real movement route. Modern techniques like geochemical fingerprinting can match a flake found at an inland kill site to an outcrop that sits near the coast or lower river. Do that repeatedly along a corridor, and you're basically tracing the highway people used. Genetic data can also help in principle. If ancient DNA from early inland burials looks closely related to DNA from people known to have lived in coastal regions at the same time, that supports a cultural and demographic connection. But those samples are still rare, and contamination and preservation issues mean we have to be cautious. Finally, there's chronology. To argue that inland traditions grew from coastal ones, the timing has to work. Coastal or lower valley sites along a given drainage either need to be slightly earlier or at least coeval with the earliest inland sites upriver. If the inland record is consistently older than anything we can find on the coast or lower river, that challenges a simple coast first, interior later picture, at least for that region. Right now, our evidence is patchy. We have tantalizing inland early sites in both North and South America, a growing handful of coastal and near-coastal candidates, and plenty of gaps in between. The working hypothesis many researchers favour is that multiple inland traditions emerged relatively quickly from a coastal-rooted population using these natural gateways, rivers, passes, ecotones, as ramps into the continent's interior. If that's roughly right, then solving the coastal route puzzle isn't just about imagining people hugging the shore. It's about filling in those connect-the-dots corridors where sea and land economies blend, and where the first Americans may have turned from beach to basin and started the process of filling an entire hemisphere. And that brings us to a twist in the story. What if there wasn't just one kind of entry at all, but overlapping pulses, some hugging the shore, others angling inland earlier than we think, all weaving together into the peopling pattern we see today? When people first hear about the coastal route, they often want a clean replacement for the old land bridge story. One path, one moment, one first people. But population history almost never works like that. Single wave stories are tidy, and textbooks love tidy. Real human expansions are messy. They're pulses and pauses, offshoots that fizzle out, side branches that get reabsorbed, local booms and local busts layered on top of each other for thousands of years. Even in regions where we have fantastic archaeological coverage, like parts of Europe or the Near East, we don't see neat, one-time colonizations. We see repeated incursions, overlapping cultures, people moving back and forth across the same corridors as climates shift and neighbours change. There is no good reason to think the Americas were an exception. So instead of asking, was it the coast or the corridor, a growing number of researchers are asking a different question. How many pulses were there, and how did they interact? One very plausible model looks like this. First, an early coastal adapted population moves along the North Pacific Rim as ice retreats from the shoreline. They're exploiting marine and near-marine resources, hopping between ice-free pockets, river mouths, and kelp-rich bays. That's pulse one. From that coastal backbone, various groups peel inland at different times, following the kinds of gateways we just talked about. Big salmon rivers, low passes, ice-free ecotones. Some of these inland pushes are very early, maybe almost contemporaneous with the initial coastal movement. Others might lag by centuries or millennia. That's not a contradiction. That's what you expect in a flexible, mobile hunter-gatherer network. Then, somewhat later in the deglaciation timeline, the classic ice-free corridor through central Canada becomes not just physically open but ecologically viable. Plants, then herbivores, then predators establish themselves. Lakes and wetlands form. Now, instead of a dead zone, you have a usable interior highway. At that point, You could get a second major pulse, people moving southward through the corridor, either descendants of those coastal pioneers who've already spread inland to the north and east, or groups that had lingered in Beringia and only now find a comfortable route south. In this kind of multi-pulse model, coastal first, corridor later isn't a competition. It's a sequence. The coast may provide the earliest viable path into the Americas' unglaciated south. The corridor may kick in as a powerful secondary route that reshapes how people, genes, and ideas move across the interior. On top of that, you probably have strong regional expansions. Once people are established in, say, the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Plains, or Central America, those regions can become their own launch pads. Local populations grow, split, and radiate outward into neighbouring environments, up into the Rockies, out onto the prairies, down into the prairies, down into tropical lowlands. From the outside, looking only at later archaeological cultures, these can look like independent traditions. In reality, they might all trace back to overlapping pulses, some coastal, some corridor, some purely continental. This is where it helps to separate two things that often get blurred together: migration routes and interaction networks. A migration route is the path that lets people enter a new region for the first time. That might be a string of ice-free coves along a glacial coast, a deglaciated valley system, or a newly habitable corridor between ice sheets. An interaction network is what happens after people are already established. Trade routes, marriage exchanges, seasonal gatherings, information moving between groups that may have gotten to a region by very different initial paths. Genetically and culturally, those later networks can stitch together lineages that arrived in separate pulses. A group whose ancestors came down a coastal route and a group whose ancestors came through the corridor might be exchanging partners and tool styles a few thousand years later. Over time, their histories blend. When modern geneticists sample living populations, what they see is the after-image of all that mixing, teasing apart which wave did what is hard, because later interaction networks blur the boundaries between early migration routes. And then, on top of the initial peopling, you have much later movements that are a different story altogether. The peopling debate is mostly about that first big threshold, how humans got south of the continental ice sheets and spread across the hemisphere, roughly before and around 15,000 years ago. Later Arctic migrations, like the spread of Paleo-Inuit, sometimes called the Arctic small tool tradition, around 5,000 years ago, and the ancestors of today's Inuit and Yupik, within the last couple of thousand years, are real, important, and archaeologically visible. But they're not about the first entry into the Americas. They're about subsequent waves reshaping the high latitudes long after the rest of the continents were already full of people. So when you hear that there were multiple migrations into the Arctic, or that some northern groups have a distinct genetic signature, that's not a refutation of the coastal route or of early corridor models. It's an additional chapter, much later in time. The same logic applies to almost every new discovery. Find an older site on the Atlantic coast. That might point to an eastern seaboard expansion, or even rare early crossings along northern Atlantic ice edges. Turn up solid early dates deep in the Amazon or in the interior southeast. That may reveal inland dispersals we didn't know existed. None of that automatically erases earlier routes. It adds layers. Think of the peopling of the Americas less like a single road being chosen, and more like a growing transportation map. First one viable path opens, then another, then shortcuts, side roads, and regional circuits. Some get heavy traffic early, some only matter later. Some fall out of use and leave only faint traces. Our job now with archaeology, genetics and geology isn't to crown one winner route and declare the rest wrong. It's to figure out which paths were available when, who likely used them, and how those different pulses braided together into the population tapestry we see today. To do that, we have to see something we've literally lost: the ancient coastlines and landscapes where many of those early steps were taken. And that means turning to a different kind of evidence: submerged worlds, shifting shorelines, and the tools scientists use to rebuild continents that no longer exist. If you want to know whether people moved along a coast that's now 50 or 100 meters underwater, step 1 is surprisingly basic. You have to put the coastline back. That starts with something called sea level curves. Global sea level hasn't just gone up in a smooth line since the Ice Age. It's been jerky. As ice sheets grew, sea level dropped. As they melted, sea level rose, sometimes in abrupt jumps when giant ice dams collapsed and released huge floods into the oceans. By looking at things like fossil coral reefs, drowned beach deposits, and oxygen isotopes from marine cores, geologists can reconstruct how much water was locked up in ice at different times. Plot that against time and you get a curve. 26,000 years ago, sea level here. 20,000 years ago there. 14,000 years ago higher again. But that's only the global average. And for our story, averages are a trap. Because the land itself is moving too. When you dump kilometers thick ice on a continent, it pushes the crust down into the mantle. Take that weight away and the crust rebounds very slowly, like memory foam. That process is called glacial isostatic adjustment. So, while global sea level is rising after the last glacial maximum, some coastlines are actually going up relative to the water. Others are going down, and some do a weird S-curve. They first emerge from the sea as the land rebounds, then drown again as meltwater keeps pouring into the oceans. That means you can't just say sea level was 120 meters lower, so the shoreline must have been out there. You have to model how the crust flexed, how gravity fields changed, how water redistributed in real time. Researchers feed in ice sheet thicknesses, mantle viscosity and shore parallel faulting into big numerical models to get relative sea level histories for specific regions. Southeast Alaska, Haida Gwaii, the outer coast of British Columbia, the Pacific Northwest Shelf. Only then can they draw ancient contour lines and say, if you were standing here 16,000 years ago, the beach would actually have been 30 kilometers seaward, or in some places, that modern inlet was dry land, but that modern valley was a shallow bay. Once the moving shoreline is pinned down as best we can, the next question is, what kind of world did those people see? That's where paleoecology comes in. Ice Age forests and marshes are gone now, but their fingerprints are still around. Lakes and bogs quietly collect pollen, spores, charcoal, and bits of plant tissue year after year, building up layered time capsules in their sediments. Drill a core out of a lake on what used to be the Ice Age coastline, slice it layer by layer, and you can watch the vegetation change through time. Under the microscope, you start seeing more spruce and alder pollen, fewer tundra herbs. That tells you when a region shifted from cold steppe to shrubland to forest. Marine cores do something similar offshore. Tiny shells of plankton record water temperatures and salinity. Layers of sand and silt can mark ancient river plumes or storm-reworked beaches. Combined, these proxies outline where productive kelp forests likely grew, where upwelling brought nutrients to the surface, where salmon-bearing rivers met the sea. On land, you can sometimes find literal ancient shorelines, raised beach ridges, old wave-cut terraces, stranded deltas now sitting high above the modern ocean because the land rebounded. Date shells or driftwood from those features. And you anchor your sea level curves to real surfaces people could have walked on. With that environmental backdrop in place, archaeologists can start playing a more informed game of hide and seek. We can't strip mine the entire continental shelf, So we need to make smart guesses about where underwater sites are most likely to be. That's where remote sensing and predictive modelling come together. Sonar systems map the seafloor in high resolution, revealing old river channels, submerged terraces, and shelf breaks that once might have been cliffs or headlands. Sub-bottom profilers peek a few meters into the sediments and pick up buried paleosols, old land surfaces now capped by marine mud. Overlay those geophysical maps with the reconstructed coastlines and paleo river mouths. Then add in what we know from terrestrial archaeology, where early sites occur on today's land, what kinds of settings people favoured, and you can start to mark high potential zones on the drowned shelf. The models might say, people tending to camp near river mouths and protected bays with access to fresh water and rich intertidal zones. In this region, under the Ice Age coastline, that combination probably occurred along this drowned valley, or that now submerged headland. Those become targets for focused underwater survey and coring. It's still a needle in a haystack problem, but it's a smaller haystack with magnets in the needles. Even when we find nothing, that absence feeds back into the models, forcing them to adjust assumptions about site density, preservation, and which microenvironments were actually attractive. On top of the physical reconstruction, there's another layer of inference. How did people actually live on these coasts? Since we don't have preserved boats or nets from 16,000 years ago in the North Pacific, researchers lean on two tools that have to be handled carefully: experimental archaeology and ethnographic analogy. Experimental archaeology is the let's build it and see approach. If we know what kinds of stone tools people had and what raw materials were around, we can try to reconstruct plausible boats, fish traps, or weirs using only those technologies. How far can a small skin boat travel hugging a glacial coastline? How much food can a weir realistically catch in a salmon run? How many people can a kelp-rich cove support seasonally? The point isn't to prove this is what they did, but to bracket the possible. Could a small group, with Ice Age tech levels, have maintained a mobile coastal lifestyle with short hops? Or do you really need long-range voyaging from day one? Ethnographic analogy adds another dimension, looking at historically documented coastal hunter-gatherers and small-scale fishers, indigenous peoples from the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, and beyond, and asking what recurring patterns show up. Flexible seasonal rounds, storage of dried fish and marine mammals, cooperation in whaling and large fish drives, complex knowledge of tides, reefs, and animal behaviour. We can't assume late Holocene societies are carbon copies of Ice Age groups. Climates, technologies, and histories all differ. But when the same kinds of environments and resources produce similar strategies over and over, that convergence hints at what's ecologically sensible. Finally, all of this only works because no one field is in charge. Geophysicists refine the isostatic models. Paleoecologists ground those models in real sediments and pollen. Oceanographers map currents and productivity zones. Geneticists propose broad timelines and population bottlenecks. Archaeologists test the predictions on land and, increasingly, underwater. Indigenous scholars bring oral histories, place knowledge and alternative framings of migration and homeland. Each line of evidence has its own uncertainties and blind spots. But as they start to overlap, sea level curves matching raised beaches, pollen records lining up with habitat models, early sites falling where the predictive maps said they should, the picture of those lost shorelines gets a little sharper. We're never going to have a perfect Google Earth view of the North Pacific coast at 16,000 years ago. But with this toolkit, the fog is thinning. Enough, maybe, to watch where the first American coast walkers could realistically have gone next, and what might finally convince the skeptics that they were really there. For all the appeal of a kelp highway and drowned Paleolithic beaches, not everyone is convinced. Coastal migration models have critics, and they're not just being stubborn. They're asking hard questions the evidence has to be able to answer. The first one hits like a hammer. Where are the early coastal sites? If people were moving along the Pacific Rim by 16,000 or 17,000 years ago, you'd expect to see campsites, kill sites, shell middens, something. But when you look at a map, most of the really early well-dated sites are inland or far south. That looks bad for the Shoreline story. The response starts with something we've already bumped into: preservation bias. For interior sites, bad luck means a river cuts through your campsite or a farmer ploughs it up. For coastal sites on a glacial margin, bad luck means the global ocean rises more than 100 metres and the crust flexes like a trampoline. If the most attractive Ice Age shorelines are now 10, 20, 50 kilometres offshore under metres of shifting sediment, the default state of early coastal archaeology is not visible but empty, it's invisible by design. Add to that another filter, the short window. If pioneer groups use small coves and river mouths for a few seasons, then moved on, those sites are tiny and shallow. A thin scatter of stone flakes on a paleo surface is easy to lose, even if you happen to core right through it. None of that magically proves the sites are out there. But it explains why we haven't found many yet is not the same as they never existed. And in the last decade, as targeted underwater work has ramped up, hints have started to appear. Submerged forests in British Columbia with human-made tools nearby, drowned estuaries off Haida Gwaii with late Pleistocene shoreline features, older and older on-land sites clustering near reconstructed ancient coasts. Critique number 2. The wall of ice problem. Skeptics argue that for big chunks of the last glacial maximum, the Pacific margin of Alaska and British Columbia wasn't some gentle beach with tide pools. It was steep, glaciated fjords, cliffed shorelines, and actively carving ice fronts. In that picture, the coast isn't a highway, it's a demolition zone. The coastal model doesn't deny that, it narrows the focus. The key isn't always open versus always closed, it's were there windows? Glaciologists and paleoecologists are increasingly pointing to pockets of ice-free land, refugia, along the outer coast, parts of the Aleutians, Kodiak, islands off southeast Alaska, stretches of Haida Gwaii. In some of these places, pollen records show shrub and even forest communities taking root while the big ice sheets still loomed inland. Marine records hint at productive kelp and upwelling zones hugging those same margins. If late glacial people were mixing travel modes, short boat hops between islands, walking on exposed shelf when sea levels were at their lowest, skirting the bases of valley glaciers, they didn't need a perfectly clear continuous beach. They needed a chain of good enough spots open at the right times. The timing of those openings is still being hammered out, but it's not looking like a uniform, impenetrable wall. Then there's the boating question. Didn't this all require seafaring sophistication way beyond what Ice Age hunter-gatherers had? This critique usually imagines Polynesian-style blue water voyaging, long, deliberate crossings far out of sight of land. If that's the standard, then yes, it's a big ask, but coastal models don't need that. They need nearshore craft that can carry people, tools, and maybe a bit of cargo along a familiar line of sight coastline. Think skin boats, dugouts, bundled log rafts, technologies that can be built and refined step by step, well before anyone attempts heroic open ocean journeys. And the global baseline suggests that by the time people were in Northeast Asia, humans had already pulled off some pretty serious water crossings. Getting to Sahul by at least 47,000 years ago required hopping between islands with deep channels in between. That doesn't mean the same exact boats were used in the North Pacific, but it does weaken the claim that Pleistocene people couldn't possibly manage repeated short sea crossings. Another critique hits much closer to the day-to-day work. Even when artifacts are found in likely settings, how do we know they're really human and really early? Wave-broken rocks can look a lot like crude tools. Rodent burrows can move artifacts up and down in the sediment. Glacial processes can redeposit older material into younger layers. If you're already inclined to doubt the coastal route, ambiguous flakes on a buried beach are easy to write off as geofacts, not artifacts. Here, the only real response is to tighten the standards and broaden the evidence. Multiple refitted flakes, showing a coherent reduction sequence, clear association with datable organics, sediments that have been micromorphologically analysed for disturbance, ideally more than one site, in more than one basin, telling a consistent story. No single broken stone is going to convince anyone. But when shoreline reconstructions, paleoecology, radiocarbon sequences, tool technology and genetics all start pointing to compatible timelines and routes, the argument shifts from does one artifact hold up to does the whole pattern make sense? And that cuts both ways because coastal models are testable. They can be wrong. If future work maps Pleistocene shorelines in key regions and finds well-preserved, undisturbed land surfaces from 18,000 to 14,000 years ago, paleosols, old deltas, former estuaries, with excellent preservation of plant remains, animal bones and sediments, but absolutely no trace of human presence, that would hurt the strongest versions of an early coastal route. If genetic data converged on a very late, tightly constrained entry, say all credible models began to demand that the founding populations only moved south of Beringia after 13,000 years ago, that would squeeze the window for a pre-Clovis coastal wave to almost nothing. If independent dating of interior and southern sites kept pushing robust, well-documented occupations older and older in places that are very unlikely to have been reached from the Pacific margin, you might have to start favouring more complex, inland first or multi-route scenarios. In other words, a coastal migration isn't a faith claim, it's a working hypothesis being stress-tested from every direction. The critics are part of that process. They force modellers to sharpen their predictions, field workers to tighten their methods, and everyone to be honest about what would count as a real blow. For now, the balance of evidence doesn't give us a single clean answer. What it does give us is a coastline that refuses to be ignored, and a research agenda aimed straight at the places where this story will either stand or fall. Before we dive into what those future discoveries might look like, quick note for the folks who like going down rabbit holes. If you're into this kind of deep time mystery, the stuff where the evidence is real, but the story is still under construction, I've put together a book on 12 of the weirdest, most fascinating puzzles in science and history. Lost migrations, vanished ecosystems, out-of-place technologies. That sort of thing. You can grab it on the website, there's a link in the description, and for this week it's discounted for channel viewers. If you want more long-form, source-heavy dives like this one, that's where they live. Alright, back to the coastline, and what it would take to move this from plausible model to hard to deny. When archaeologists talk about a smoking gun for a coastal route, they're not imagining one magic artifact that settles everything. They're thinking of a package of evidence that all points the same way. At the top of that wish list are securely dated coastal camps. Not just a couple of flakes on a buried beach, but full contexts, hearths with charcoal you can radiocarbon date, animal bones with cut marks, tools in undisturbed layers. Ideally in places that were clearly shoreline or near-shore environments between, say, 18,000 and 14,000 years ago. If we start finding sites like that along the North Pacific margin, Alaska, British Columbia, down into the Pacific Northwest, and they consistently line up in age and technology with early inland sites, the argument shifts. That would show that people weren't just appearing in the interior. They were already living and reusing coastal landscapes as the ice retreated. Layered on top of that, we'd love to see direct traces of watercraft and coastal gear. Boats themselves almost never survive from that age. Wood rots, skins decay, but their fingerprints can linger. Things like worked wooden paddles preserved in anoxic mud, holes in planks with abrasion patterns that scream, "Lashings went here," stone or bone net weights, antler wedges and sled runners associated with launching and hauling boats. Even more subtle are the bits of cordage and woven material, twisted plant fibres used to sew skins, small fragments of nets, impressions of rope in clay or sediment. Under the right conditions, cold, waterlogged, low oxygen, those can survive for tens of thousands of years. Then there are shell middens. A midden is basically an ancient trash heap. A systematic shell midden on a Pleistocene shoreline would be a gold mine. Repeated layers of discarded shells, fish bones, sea mammal remains, sometimes mixed with hearths and tools, give you a time series of coastal use. If you can date each layer, track how the species mix changes, and tie that to sea level and climate records, you're not just saying someone visited the coast once. You're saying these people were plugged into a marine ecosystem for generations. So where do we look for all this? 3 targets stand out: islands, submerged shelves, and ancient estuaries. Islands are critical because they act like time capsules. During low sea level, what's now an island might have been a hill on a much larger exposed shelf. When the water rose, the lower, more erodible terrain was drowned or stripped, but the higher ground could preserve soils, caves, and terraces where people camped. Outer coast archipelagos in the Aleutians, Gulf of Alaska, Haida Gwaii, and the Pacific Northwest are prime candidates. They may have been the stepping stones in that good enough coastal chain open when the mainland was still pinned under ice. Submerged continental shelves are the big one, the most attractive Ice Age shorelines. The gentle slopes, protected bays, and river mouths are now underwater. That's where you expect stable camps, boat landings, and shell middens to have formed. Modern tools like multi-beam sonar, sub-bottom profiling, and underwater coring let researchers map buried ancient shorelines, identify old river channels, and sample paleosols. Once you can outline an 18,000-year-old coastline on the seafloor, you can start asking, where would people have gone? Where are the likely fresh water sources, the kelp beds, the sheltered landings? Ancient estuaries, the drowned mouths of Ice Age rivers, are a hybrid of both worlds. They concentrate fish, birds, and marine mammals, and they often have fine-grained sediments that preserve plant remains, pollen, and sometimes even footprints. If early coastal travellers were setting up camp anywhere for more than a night or two, those are prime spots. But archaeology isn't the only line of evidence that can sharpen this picture. Ancient DNA has teeth in this debate too, literally. Every time we get a new well-dated genome from key regions, Northeast Asia, Beringia, the Pacific Northwest, the Interior Corridor, early South American sites, it acts like another anchor point on the family tree. Ancient DNA can help with at least 3 big questions. First, timing. If genomes from Siberia and Beringia show a long, stable population sitting in the north until very late, that compresses the window for an early coastal dispersal. If instead we see branching and movement signals earlier than 16,000 years ago, that's more room for a shoreline pulse. Second, roots, genetic affinities between early peoples on the Pacific margin and those far inland can hint at whether coastal groups fed the interior or whether separate streams came through different gateways. For example, if an early individual from the interior plains clusters tightly with ancient DNA from a coastal site, that smells like movement from coast to interior. Third, structure. Patterns of genetic diversity can tell us whether there was a single founding wave that rapidly split and spread, or several pulses separated by time. If island and mainland genomes show subtle but consistent differences that might signal a distinct coastal population holding on for a while, instead of just being a corridor. All of this is still in motion. Every new core pulled from a drowned fjord, every sonar map of a buried bay, every newly sequenced tooth from a cave in Alaska or Chile has the potential to move the line a little. The real question is, when all these lines of evidence finally converge, archaeology, submerged landscapes, paleoclimate, genetics, will the first Americans look more like a single bold dash through an inland corridor, a slow experimental creep along a kelp-rich coast, or some messy combination we haven't quite imagined yet? So where does that leave the good old Bering Land Bridge? It's still there, it's still real, and it still matters a lot. Nobody serious is saying, forget Beringia, it was all canoes and kelp forests. The emerging picture is more like this. Beringia is the northern homeland and staging ground. The coast is one of the main exit ramps that actually helps people get into the rest of the hemisphere on the timetable the evidence demands. Think of it as two layers of the same story. On the big, slow layer, you've got populations building up in Beringia over thousands of years. Genetic data point to a standstill period, where the ancestors of Native Americans are sitting somewhere in Northeast Asia and or Beringia, partly isolated from other Eurasian groups. Paleoenvironmental records show that at certain times Beringia wasn't just a frozen wasteland. It had steppe tundra mosaics, game animals, and areas where people could plausibly live and adapt to high-latitude life. That's the foundation. That's the who and where of the source population. On the faster, more dynamic layer, you've got how those people actually moved south once ice sheets and climate allowed it. Here the coastal route becomes hard to ignore. Archaeology in the interior says the ice-free corridor probably wasn't a green, game-rich boulevard until quite late, after people are already showing up thousands of kilometres to the south. Paleoecology shows that the North Pacific coast, while harsh, had pockets of productivity tied to kelp, fish runs and marine mammals. Sea level curves remind us that the best early campsites are now under tens of metres of water. Genetics hints at an early diversification of American lineages that fits more comfortably with a relatively early entry, not a last-minute dash through a freshly opened corridor. When you stack those together, a pattern starts to emerge. What's on firmer ground right now? That there was a Beringian population source with its own history, that continental ice sheets blocked a simple interior route for a key window of time, that people were capable of coastal adaptation and seafaring long before 15,000 years ago. That early sites in both North and South America are old enough to make a purely late-opening interior corridor look strained. What's still genuinely debated? Exactly when the corridor became not just technically open, but biologically and logistically usable for human groups. Precisely how continuous and welcoming that coastal kelp highway really was during glacial maxima versus brief warm spells. Whether there were one, two, or several distinct pulses of migration, and how many of those hugged the shoreline. And towering over all of it is the missing underwater record. Until we've systematically surveyed more of those drowned shelves and estuaries, there's a built-in bias. Interior camps on high ground preserve, low-lying coasts sink. That's not a conspiracy, it's just physics and taphonomy. This is why you'll hear scientists use careful language, consistent with, compatible with, best current model. Paleoenvironmental data outline when and where habitats existed. Archaeology on land shows when humans were definitely present in particular regions. Genetics constrains population histories and timings. Sea level reconstructions tell us how much of the ancient stage is now off limits to casual digging, None of those on their own can decree it was 100% this route. Together, they set boundary conditions. The coastal route isn't a romantic add-on. It's a way to reconcile timing, ecology and technology with a Beringian homeland that we already have strong evidence for. So the story isn't being ripped up and rewritten because someone had a cool idea about boats. It's being gradually sharpened as multiple independent lines of evidence get better. Beringia stays central. The shoreline may simply be the missing piece that makes the whole map finally make sense. If you found this interesting, it helps a lot if you like the video, subscribe and drop a comment. Let me know where you're listening from. I'm always curious how far these deep time rabbit holes are travelling. And if you want to go further down that rabbit hole, the book I mentioned earlier dives into 12 of the strangest prehistoric and scientific mysteries we know of. This coastal story is just one flavour of that. You can read more about it or grab a copy on the website. The link is in the description.